Welcome back to the On Duties podcast, a production of the Ciceronian Society. We are reading through and commenting on, section by section, Cicero's great work On Duties. And we're picking up again here with episode 5, taking a look at Cicero's discussion of justice. This is a good place for me to mention at the start of this episode that we are not a society dedicated to the study of Cicero. He is our namesake and our inspiration, but our mission as a society is to explore the themes of tradition, place, and things divine. This is one of the first things we've done as a group that's focused specifically on the work of Cicero. So while it's valuable, there's a lot else to the Ciceronian Society in our programming, our conferences, our journal, and our other podcast, The Sower, besides the work of Cicero. So I wanted to mention for anybody who's enjoying that there's quite a lot more to explore on our YouTube channel, on our website, ciceroniansociety.org, etc. So I'm Chris Anadale. I teach philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University. And joining me for this episode of the podcast is Katherine Bradshaw. She is a Latin and Greek fellow at the Ancient Language Institute and a regular attendee at our conferences. Katherine, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm happy to be here.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about us and your background so we know what to expect from your contributions, and then we'll get back into reading Cicero at Book 1, Section 20, where we left off.
Certainly. So as you mentioned, I teach for the Ancient Language Institute, which is an online school, and I teach Latin and Ancient Greek for them at the college level to adults around the world. I'm also an adjunct instructor at Abilene Christian University teaching first-year Greek in person. So my areas of interest are where William Shakespeare's works, the classical Greek and Roman literature and literary tradition, and virtue formation meet. And so one of my fascinations in that work is on the concept of duty. So officium, pietas, all of these related concepts are very dear to my heart. And so hence Cicero's De Officiis, which actually influenced Shakespeare quite a bit, is a natural focus of mine. So
That's fantastic. That's great to hear. In fact, let me do this before we even get into this. We've Josh and I have had a few episodes before talking about the foundations of virtue, about the nature of duty, and about this first virtue of wisdom, which I've said Cicero is a kind of man of action, a man of public life, sort of speeds past that because that's not really where his heart is. What does officiis mean? Well, what is an officium? I've described it sometimes, trying to grapple with it with Josh, as something like what is appropriate to one's station in life. What further light can you shed on that vocabulary for us?
yeah, so you're hitting very nicely on the fact that officia, that's the plural of officium is officia. So
Hmm.
officia are things that are required of one. They are things. So the Oxford Latin Dictionary talks about how it is what one is bound to do in the way of service, one's duty or obligations, moral obligation, as well as the actions that fulfill those duties and the sense of that obligation. So
Hmm.
it's very much this is what I owe to other people because of my station in life, because of their station in life, because of my family ties, the unchosen obligations that I was born into, the unchosen community that I was born into, that shapes my officia. So family, country, etc. Those are the things that I owe service and dedication and action toward.
Oh, that's fantastic. Let me ask you this, just if you'll permit a philosopher's question. Are they always contingent and circumstantial? Does that just shape what they are, or are they essentially like sort of social facts about you?
They're, hmm, wow, that is an excellent question. They are generally contingent. So it depends. So if I am born in, well, I'm born into a family, so I owe duties to my parents. Um, Now, if my parents were no longer with us, thankfully they are here still, but then my officia to them would no longer apply as they would if they were living.
Right.
Um, However, they are part of the law of nature. So they are natural duties that I owe. So it's not essential to me as a person, but it is something that no person does not have.
Okay, that makes perfect sense that everybody should honor their own parents, whoever they are, right? And there's
Yes.
nobody who doesn't honor parents. So that's very good. Okay, well, thank you for that interlude. I've been wondering about that for a while, whether we were thinking of the title word in just the right way. Let me pick up where we left off with the beginning of section or chapter 19. We'll go through 19 and 20 and then talk a bit about them. This is where Cicero is shifting from what he's saying about wisdom to introducing the topic of justice. In the first few chapters here, I think he makes some general observations about the nature, the origin of justice, and some concepts like property and keeping one's word, fidelity, that are connected to justice. So I'll take the beginning. We are in the middle of page 9, if you'd like to read along with us in the Cambridge text version. Here we go. We have now discussed the first source of duty. Of the three that remain, the most wide-reaching one is the reasoning by which the fellowship of men with one another and the communal life are held together. There are two parts of this: justice, the most illustrious of the virtues, on account of which men are called good, and the beneficence connected with it, which may be called either kindness or liberality. Of justice, the first office is that no man should harm another unless he has been provoked by injustice. The next, that one should treat common goods as common and private goods as one's own. Now, no property is private by nature, but rather by long occupation, as when men moved into some empty property in the past, or by victory, when they acquired it in war, or by law, by settlement, by agreement, and by lot. The result is that the land of Arpinium is said to belong to the Arpinites, and that of Tusculum to the Tusculani. The distribution of private property is of a similar kind. Consequently, since what becomes each man's own comes from what had in nature been common, each man should hold on to whatever has fallen to him. If anyone else should seek any of it for himself, he will be violating the law of human fellowship. So that's the end of section 21. Um, I'll offer you first comment on this, Katherine. What do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting that Cicero divides again, Cicero, the consummate orator. We must have our definitions first. So saying that not just justice is the most illustrious, the most respected of the virtues, and it's the source of goodness, which is a very Aristotelian thought. But then the fact that you have to subdivide it into you have justice proper, and then you also have what's in Latin called beneficentia or liberalitas, the generosity or the good deeds that go with justice. So there's that two division.
Yeah, I was curious about this. We won't get to liberality for some time now, but it sounds like that he's going to consider separately the actual activities that you do to put your justice, your goodwill towards your fellow man into action, huh?
Yes, yeah. So it's similar to you and Josh talked about the difference between the complete good and the medium good.
Hmm.
So it's Cicero is still making those differentiations throughout.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, makes sense. My thought beyond this was as well that he gives us the two offices of justice, right? Do not do anyone harm unless you've been provoked by injustice. So you don't harm anybody except under provocation, and the provocation has to be that an injustice has been done to you, and so
Mhm.
that justice would be compatible with restoring order. And then this idea of defending common goods, right? To treat common goods as common, respect them as common, and don't try to privatize them, and respect private property. And then there's this discussion of the way in which all goods are held in common at first. And so private property, we don't really have a labor theory of property here. We instead, he says that private property becomes ours out of the common stock of property. And for this reason, respect all property wherever it is. If it's common, leave it common. He'll say more about that in the coming sections. And if it's private, respected. So it's an offense against justice to do this, but offenses against property are offenses against justice and flowing out of the need to live in a human community, being properly related to your fellow humans, right?
Yes. And this is a piece of kind of ancient thought in general that it seems often, at least in the kind of peripatetic and Aristotle and Plato tradition, that it's not just private property is not just it's important because it's mine. It's that if one does not respect private property, then the whole of the community is damaged.
Hmm.
It's like Cicero says, if someone seeks to violate someone's private property rights, he violates the law of human fellowship. So it's the entirety of what makes society society is violated by violating property rights. And it's interesting, he does say for sources of privatization that it's living there, winning it in war, or agreement.
Mhm.
So there it's not quite what we see in the 16 and 1700s theories, but it's oddly resonant, which would make sense because all of those authors would have read Cicero.
Right. And that's actually so here's a place where we see that property disputes between individuals actually concern the whole. The
Mhm.
city that properly takes an interest in the fact that I've stolen some of your property because it is an attack not just upon you and your property, but upon the public order as a whole.
Right.
That's a nice way of tying it all together. So would you like to read chapter 22 or shall I?
I'm happy to do so.
Fantastic. Please do.
We are not born for ourselves alone, to use Plato's splendid words, but our country claims for itself one part of our birth, and our friends another. Moreover, as the Stoics believe, everything produced on the earth is created for the use of mankind, and men are born for the sake of men, so that they may be able to assist one another. Consequently, we ought in this to follow nature as our leader, to contribute to the common stock the things that benefit everyone together, and by the exchange of dutiful services, by giving and receiving expertise and effort and means, to bind fast the fellowship of men with each other.
Let's go on and do 23 as well.
All right. Moreover, the keeping of faith is fundamental to justice, that is, constancy and truth in what is said and agreed. Therefore, though this will perhaps seem difficult to some, let us venture to imitate the Stoics, who hunt assiduously for the derivations of words, and let us trust that keeping faith, fides, is so called because what has been said is actually done, fiat. Of injustice, there are two types. Men may inflict injury, or else, when it is being inflicted upon others, they may fail to deflect it, even though they could. Anyone who makes an unjust attack on another, whether driven by anger or by some other agitation, seems to be laying hands, so to speak, upon a fellow. But also, the man who does not defend someone or obstruct the injustice when he can is at fault just as if he had abandoned his parents or his friends or his country.
Wow. That's great stuff. This is you can feel that you can feel the orator sort of singing through the words here. If I could take
Always
privilege
the
of first
orator,
comment.
Cicero.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're not born for ourselves alone. We live in community. We live in a society, as they say. And I love this expression here. Our country claims for itself one part of our birth and our friends another. So
Mhm.
I have loyalties. I've sort of motivated action, not just for myself and my interests, but for the sake of my country, my people. I have a people, and it's not, as you said before, it's an unchosen relationship. It's not really voluntary for me to be loyal to my people. The example I try to use to communicate this to college students sometimes is the situation of Michael Corleone at the beginning of The Godfather, the
Ah,
movie. Is that he's sort of got a foot in two worlds, right? Between sort of the American war hero and member of the Italian family, but he he has some choices to make, but the obligations on him are not sort of optional in a sense. That's kind
right.
of the part of the I think the moral drama and the tragedy of his character is that there are claims upon him that he has to fulfill. But uh,
Yeah.
more about that some other time, perhaps. Um, the Stoics here mentioned twice, and Cicero kind of thinks of himself as a sort of a Stoic, doesn't he? We should imitate nature, right? Let's follow along with nature. And align our will, ourselves, and our practice with the divine logos, with the order of things, so that we can exchange dutiful services and bind fast the fellowship of men. What I'd love to hear your comments, including on his. I'm not sure if he's meaning this as a pun at the end or sort of a teasing reference to the way the Stoics are always drilling down on language. What's your take on those things?
Well, this is a fun one. As someone who likes to delve into the etymologies of things myself, um, the, the the teasing reference here is actually sort of a cover up for Cicero's been saying this in other places for a while. Um, and so this is not just like, oh, I got this from the Stoics. He's sort of using the
Okay.
Stoics as cover here. And so yes, it is kind of a pun, but it's more of a what he's saying here is that the word fides, which is the word for faith, trust, keeping one's word, loyalty, it has an enormous semantic range in Roman literature. And so this word probably grew out of the word fiat, which is in Latin for let it be. And that's the case he's making. And he's made this several other places before he writes De Officiis.
Okay,
So,
wow.
yeah. And Cicero doesn't he considers himself sort of more aligned with the Stoics than the Epicureans, but he finds the Stoic tendency to quibble about words all the time very annoying, and which is one of the reasons why he doesn't say like I am a Stoic, and why other places the Stoic character is one of the people he argues against.
Ah, okay. I appreciate that. That's good to know more. Good to talk to somebody who's more widely read in Cicero than me. These I it's interesting to me, yeah, the keeping faith, fides, comes out of fiat, that it should be done. So he finishes this chapter by talking about injustice, which is going to occupy us through the next 5 or 6 chapters or so. That there are two kinds. There's a positive injustice where I inflict injury upon someone else without provocation of a prior injustice. And then there's this later kind of injustice. He's going to use this to criticize Plato coming up. This is where this attracted my attention as a philosophy teacher. Um, if
Mhm.
one fails to stop injustice when one could, this also is a violation of justice. And so, um, man who does not defend someone, that's just as much his fault as if he had abandoned his parents. And that's fighting words, is it not?
Indeed, particularly in that culture where it is
Mhm.
right under, and Cicero talks about this later in De Officiis, but the duty to parents is right underneath the duty to country, and it's pretty close.
Mhm.
Um, so this is a very bold statement to make. Um, yeah.
Okay. Well, let's dig into the next 4 chapters are relatively short and deal with this first kind of injustice. Why don't we at least begin those in this episode, and we'll see how much further we can go. Okay.
All right.
I'll take over if you don't mind. This is chapter 24 at the bottom of page 10. Those injustices that are purposely inflicted for the sake of harming another often stem from fear. In such cases, the one who is thinking of harming someone else is afraid that if he does not do so, he himself will be affected by some disadvantage. In most cases, however, men set about committing injustice in order to secure something that they desire. Where this fault is concerned, avarice is extremely widespread. Riches are sought both for the things that are necessary to life and in order to enjoy pleasures. In men of greater spirit, however, the desire for wealth has as its goal influence and the opportunity to gratify others. Marcus Crassus, for example, recently said that no one who wanted to be preeminent in the Republic would have wealth enough if he could not feed an army on its yield. Magnificent accoutrements and an elegant and plentiful style of life give men further delight. The result of such things is that desire for money has become unlimited. Such expansion of one's personal wealth as harms no one is not, of course, to be disparaged, but committing injustice must always be avoided. So, Katherine, what comments on this?
I particularly appreciate how Cicero traces the connection between fear and the commission of injustice. Because I think in modern days that's not generally what injustice is traced to. Um, and of course, injustice being not giving people what is their due. And so it seems that a lot of times there seems to be a kind of a systemic uh, thing that we must blame in the modern world. But for Cicero, it's no, this is born out of fear. This is born out of uh, a, a, a desire not to be injured oneself.
Mhm.
And so it's a very human way of reading injustice. It's not that the person who commits the injustice is always a moral monster. It's often that they fear some injustice being done to them first, and so they preemptively attack. Um, and he saw this all over the place in his own life through the civil wars, because this is of course written after Caesar has been assassinated, and as Antony and Augustus are rising to power and are controlling things. And so Cicero is himself, I think, fearful of what Antony in particular will do. But the things that he has seen are so many times attributed to, oh, Caesar feared to be killed and therefore crossed the Rubicon and did something illegal or something like that.
Okay. Hmm. Yeah, I noticed this. Um, Fear is a common source of injustice. Desire for something, which is maybe a little bit
Hmm.
more common. And then he speaks about riches for the pursuit of pleasure, but then also men of great spirit. He talks of, I don't know much of the history of Marcus Crassus, but I have heard people refer recently to the idea of being able to privately support an army as a sort of test of whether one could be preeminent in a collapsing republic that has a
Hmm.
sort of menacing sound to it. Um,
Well,
but then
and
I'm sorry, go ahead.
sorry, Crassus was the richest man in Rome um, in
Mhm.
Cicero's lifetime. And so this comment is partially, it's possible that this is autobiographical because Crassus ran out of money at one point during one of his campaigns. And so after that campaign, he rose to be the wealthiest man in Rome. And so that Crassus was sort of a rival and enemy of Cicero's until he died in battle. And so Cicero is interested in Crassus and his injustices and why they might have come.
Wow. Yeah, that's the idea as well that if you want to be really preeminent, how much wealth is enough to pay the army? That's out of your own pocket that then win
Right.
their loyalty. Definitely a sign that the republic has fallen and that we're moving into strange new times ahead. Right.
Yeah.
Um, the final note here, um, very Ciceronian, I think. Uh, Expanding one's personal wealth when it harms no one is not to be disparaged. It doesn't positively recommend it, but we won't disparage or insult it. But one must never commit injustice.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's see. I think I read that last bit. Would you like to take maybe 26 and 27?
Certainly.
On finishing up with positive injustice.
Sounds good. However, men are led most of all to being overwhelmed by forgetfulness of justice when they slip into desiring positions of command or honor or glory. That is why we find the observation of Ennius to be widely applicable. To kingship belongs neither sacred fellowship nor faith. For if there is any area in which it is impossible for many to be outstanding, there will generally be such competition there that it is extremely difficult to maintain a sacred fellowship. The rash behavior of Gaius Caesar has recently made that clear. He overturned all the laws of gods and men for the sake of the preeminence that he had imagined himself in his mistaken fancy. There is something troubling in this type of case, in that the desire for honor, command, power, and glory usually exist in men of the greatest spirit and most brilliant intellectual talent. Therefore, one must be all the more careful not to do wrong in this way. In every case of injustice, it matters a great deal whether the injury was committed through some agitation of the spirit, which is generally brief and momentary, or purposefully and with forethought. For those things that happen because of some sudden impulse are less serious than those inflicted after reflection and preparation. But I have now said enough about actually committing injustice.
Very good. Thank you. So we have, I assume the reference to Gaius Caesar here is to uh,
Yes, to the Julius Caesar.
the Julius Caesar, who, but this is being written about 6 months after Caesar's assassination. I think in autumn of 44. That's my
That sounds
understanding
right to
from
me.
things I've read. So definitely very much we might say in the news, the big
Mhm.
and big late Republic, early Imperial event that everybody is still buzzing about. And he calls it just this is a very troubling thing that happened, that a man who was so interested in preeminence was led across the Rubicon, as you say, but led to commit injustices. Is this political commentary on the part of Cicero, or is he trying to make a sort of moral point to the reader?
Yes.
Fair enough.
Uh, so Cicero was very much a supporter of the assassins of Caesar after the fact. And so there is a current that kind of runs through the De Officiis of little comments that sort of justify Caesar's assassination, um, and comment on it in this less than complimentary way. And then also at the same time, the idea of offering moral exempla, so exemplum in Latin is example, go figure. But it has this extra oomph for the Romans because the way that the Romans trained their children in moral instruction was not through a sacred text per se. So it's not like Christian spiritual formation where it's based in scripture, but it was through telling the children these stories of these great men, usually from the distant past, but also from the recent past, of this person did this, be like him. This person did this, do not be like him. And so that the idea of offering examples is not just, oh, I'm going to give you an illustration. No, this has a moral dimension to it.
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting because as well, I'm thinking of a friend who's teaching a high school class that covering the Aeneid, and of course the Aeneid begins.
Ooh,
Virgil's writing around not quite the same time, the same century, perhaps. My sense of dates are off, but Virgil at the beginning certainly plays up Caesar as being destined for divinization, who will dwell on Olympus with the gods. And you get the feeling of the sort of partisan spirit that is here, even among the greatest writers of the age, that everybody's got a side and everybody's sort of pushing. They've got a take on whether Caesar, good or bad, deserved to die, deserved to live, etc.
absolutely. Absolutely. The great authors are still human beings who have their own opinions.
Right, right. So we've gotten as far as, I'm sorry, let's see here. What else? Oh, we have a final comment here towards the end about, well, it matters whether it was deliberate or sort of passionate, sort of a moment of passion, because it is more blameworthy, of course, to contemplate, to deliberate over, and then to deliberately inflict. Um, well, in both cases, it's deliberate, but with we might say malice aforethought.
Mhm.
He doesn't do much more than just note this is an aggravating factor here at the end, doesn't he?
Right. And I think it's because he assumes that his audience, Marcus in this case, will just agree with him and it'll be very obvious to him. But
Mhm.
this is a thread that runs throughout the philosophical tradition from which Cicero's drawing, because um, malice aforethought is something the Stoics think about. It's something the Aristotelians think about. Um, is it better to be overruled by passion or to have thought of it beforehand? Obviously, it's non-malicious if it's overruled by passion. But this is one of the reasons why the Stoics don't want you to they do want us to subdue our passions because they lead us to do things that are against nature. So,
Right, right. We might say that we're indirectly responsible in the sense that we're responsible for those passions, but
mhm,
what they force us to do is sort of at one remove, perhaps, from what we deliberate over.
right. And for
Okay,
Aristotle, it would be, what we are habituated to do and what we have habituated ourselves to do.
right. Right. Well, thank you very much, Katherine. We are, I think, at the end of our half hour for this episode. We have just finished with chapters 20 through 27 of Book One of On Duties. And I want to thank Katherine Bradshaw for being our guest today, and thank all you guys for watching, listening to the On Duties podcast. We'll turn to more of Cicero's thoughts on justice in the next episode. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And thank you, Katherine.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the On Duties podcast, a production of the Ciceronian Society. We are reading through chapter by chapter with commentary, Cicero's great work on duties, and we've come as far as the end of Book One, Chapter 27, in the middle of Cicero's discussion of justice. We've just finished talking about a positive injustice, and now we'll be talking in this chapter about negative injustice in the chapters that follow. I'm Chris Anadale. I teach philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University. I'm the podcast editor for the Ciceronian Society and have been coming to their conferences for a long time. Joining me is Katherine Bradshaw. Katherine?
Hello, I'm Katherine Bradshaw. I'm a Latin and Ancient Greek Fellow at the Ancient Language Institute, which is an online school, and I teach college-level Latin and Ancient Greek online for them, as well as beginning Ancient Greek for Abilene Christian University.
Wonderful. Thanks again for being on this episode with us, Katherine.
It's my pleasure.
I want to pick up where we left off, which is at chapter 28 of Book One. We are at the top of page 12 of this Cambridge edition, if you want to read along at home. I'll take the first chapter, if you don't mind. All right.
Sounds great.
As for neglecting to defend others and deserting one's duty, there tend to be several causes of this. Some men do not wish to incur enmities or toil or expense. Others are hindered by indifference, laziness, inactivity, or some pursuits or business of their own, to the extent that they allow the people whom they ought to protect to be abandoned. We must therefore watch out in case Plato's words about philosophers prove not to be sufficient, for he said that they are immersed in the investigation of the truth, and that disdaining the very things for which most men vigorously strive and even fight one another to the death, they count them as nothing. Because of this, he calls them just. They observe one type of justice indeed, that they should harm no one else by inflicting injury, but they fall into another, for hindered by their devotion to learning, they abandon those whom they ought to protect. And so he thinks that they should not even embark upon public life unless they are forced to do so. But that is something done more fairly when done voluntarily, for something that is done rightly is only just if it is voluntary. Let's stop there. Of course, this concerns me greatly as I teach Plato to undergraduates frequently. What are your thoughts on this chapter, Katherine?
Well, this is very bold of Cicero, first of all. But it actually goes well with something he says in De Oratore on the orator, where it gets back to what you've talked about with Josh before about the practical versus the speculative. And so Cicero in De Oratore says that Socrates is actually responsible for separating wisdom and eloquence, so the speculative and the practical, and that before Socrates, according to Cicero, they were together, at least theoretically. And so it seems that there is this sense of, well, theoretically, the philosopher should be just because he does no injury to anyone else. But practically, because there is another side of injustice, the philosopher, if he just sticks to what Plato's description says, will commit some kind of injustice and actually commits injustice by not getting involved in his community and by staying out of it.
It's interesting to me that, of course, we talk about what officium means. It's a duty, it's a service that is owed by virtue of a relationship. that you have. And he says that the Platonic philosopher who wants to live outside of the cave, to dwell among the forms and not think about these things, is failing in his duty he is abandoning those for whom he ought to care. And again, I recognize those as being fighting words for Cicero, right? You have an officium and you are neglecting it to go off and do something else, which he introduces first as being, I noticed this, what does he call this? Um, they inactivity or some pursuits of business of their own. Right. I've just got something better to do than actually look after the health of the res publica. I'm going to go read my books. I'm going to go do my own thing. And that this is a kind of injustice because it's abandoning people who depend on you, people to whom you owe a service. And he's rhetorically here, maybe it's a little bit seems balanced. Well, they do justice in one way, but injustice in another way. But honestly, I sort of feel the thrust of the knife there. Am I on track, you think, with that?
Oh, absolutely. This is it again. Cicero, the consummate orator. He makes it sound nice, but it is an enormous dig at anyone who thinks that he should not be involved in the res publica unless he's forced to do so. And I love that last little thing that he says, that it is only something that is done rightly is only just if it is voluntary. Because just because officia are obligatory, like I'm obligated to do them, that doesn't mean that I'm forced to do them. I still have to choose to fulfill my officia. Now it's wrong if I don't, but it's a choice. And so that element there, I think, is part of this as well for Cicero, that you should want to serve the community as well as do it.
Yeah. Yeah, this fits in with if we had a sort of theme from the early episodes of this podcast. I told Josh, I think some of this is Cicero, the public man, even in exile from public life, to his writing to his son studying in Athens, saying, "Hey, you know what? The public life is still far worthier and nobler of your attention and your effort than the ivory tower studies of just becoming wise, learning the forms, devoting yourself purely to the life of the intellect. It's by its very nature much more humane and sort of, well, dutiful to
Hmm.
to to do, even with the risks and the errors and the compromises that it involves, right? So
Definitely.
I do love that something is done well only when it is voluntary. And if Plato says the philosopher rules involuntarily, the philosopher's not really virtuous, then is he? He's doing what he must. He's
Right.
bowing to compulsion. So,
Oh my.
uh, would you, would you like to read chapter 29?
Certainly.
And why don't you take 30 as well, because they're both short.
Will do. There are also some who, whether through devotion to preserving their personal wealth or through some kind of dislike of mankind, claim to be attending to their own business and appear to do no one any injustice. But though they are free from one type of injustice, they run into another. Such men abandon the fellowship of life because they contribute to it nothing of their devotion, nothing of their effort, nothing of their means. Since we have set out the two types of injustice and added the causes of each, and since we established previously what are the things that constitute justice, we shall now be able to judge with ease what is our duty on each occasion. That is, if we do not love ourselves too much. For it is difficult to be concerned about another's affairs. Terence's Chremes, however, thinks nothing that is human is another's affair. Yet, in fact, we do tend to notice and feel our own good and bad fortune more than that of others, which we see as if at a great distance, as if a great distance intervenes. Accordingly, we do not make the same judgments about them and about ourselves. It is good advice, therefore, that prevents you from doing anything if you are unsure whether it is fair or unfair. For fairness shines out by itself, and hesitation signifies that one is contemplating injustice.
Very good. Thank you. Well, we have the conclusion here in chapter 29 of this very brief consideration of what we might call negative injustice, the injustice of neglect of one's duty to defend others who are presumably therefore in one's charge, right? For to whom one owes a duty of service. And this is related to the critique of the Platonic philosopher kings who have to be called down, sort of dragged down. Now there's a funny symmetry, right? Because the non-philosopher has to be dragged up the path into the light in Plato's cave, and now the
Mhm.
philosopher kings, the wise men, have to be dragged back down into the cave, in a sense, in order to rule
Yes.
over it, which has a kind of absurdity to it. And people wiser than I can make sense of it, perhaps. But this section 29, some people um, devotion to preserving their personal wealth, we understand that in our time, or some kind of dislike of mankind, just a sort of general misanthropy. Right. I'm teaching a course on Schopenhauer this coming semester, and I think, well,
Oh.
there's a man who had a sort of general disdain for humanity at least some level. Um, they will attend to their own business. This is the desire to live a purely private life, right? Say, well,
Mhm.
I'm just going to look after myself. You guys look after yourselves. You guys get together and vote and look after the res publica, and I'm just going to devote myself to learning or money making or whatever else. Such men abandon the fellowship of life. They contribute nothing to it. They're not invested in public affairs. That seems to him to be a pretty serious offense against justice and against sort of fellow feeling. Everybody around them ought to be offended that they're not taking part. Is that right?
Yes. And it's again, this is not an abnormal view. I think because of the influence of Plato, um, we tend to hear about the unwilling philosopher king a lot, but with the even the Athenians, their word for private person is idiotes, and you can hear that we get our
Mm,
word idiot from that word. Because an
wow.
idiotes is a purely private person who only cares about his own affairs and participates not at all in public life. And so he is not interested. And so this was a very common idea for the ancient world, particularly for, I mean, Athens is a democracy, so it's a different thing. But that feeling of, no, if I am part of a community, I have an obligation to care about that community and therefore to act in a way that will benefit that community is very much in the water for Cicero and his contemporaries.
Wow. Yeah, I did not know about idiotes. That's something else. I'll have to share that with some of my students when the time comes.
My students always enjoy that one.
What are your thoughts on section 30 here that this explaining why it is that we genuinely do have a sort of selfish preference for ourselves. We should at least acknowledge that.
Yes, it's definitely there, and it's interesting that Cicero quotes Terence here because the character who says nothing that is human is another's affair, um, it's usually translated something like "I am a human being, nothing that is human is foreign to me," which sounds very altruistic, but the character Chremes is actually kind of a busybody, and so
Hmm.
um,
Oh, no.
yeah, so
So yeah, so
it's a double-edged quote even. Um, so there is this sense that the privatized view is on the one hand something that is very modern in its emphasis, but it is not modern in its existence, because each of us views our own things from our own perspective, but then also that's the thing that's closest to us. That's the thing that affects us most. That's the thing. It's kind of like you, each of us hears our own voice through our head. And so we
yeah,
never, unless we record our voice and hear it back, we never hear ourselves the way other people hear us. And so that same kind of blocking in of our perspective works morally as well as acoustically, if we are not careful.
yeah, that makes great sense. I love that metaphor. That's very strong. I think this this sounded to me again like sort of Cicero in dad mode, right? Well,
Yes.
obviously everyone sort of, sees his own affairs most clearly, and those are the things that are most important to him. We'll acknowledge that. That's a sort of built-in bias, but to be a mature member of the community means to rise above that on the occasions when it's demanded, right? To embrace that and say, that's the kind of life I'm going to live is to be somewhat childish, I suppose.
Hmm. I think Cicero would heartily agree.
Well, let me take sections 31 and 32. And if we have
Mhm.
time, perhaps you can take 33. That'll take us, I think, to the next division in book one.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks. Occasions often arise when the actions that seem most worthy of a just man, of him whom we call good, undergo a change, and the opposite becomes the case. For example, from time to time it becomes just to set aside such requirements as the returning of a deposit, or the carrying out of a promise, or other things that relate to truth and to keeping faith, and not to observe them. For it is seemly that they should be referred to those fundamentals of justice that I laid out at the beginning. First, that one should harm no one, and secondly, that one serve the common advantage. Such actions alter with the circumstances, and duty alters likewise, and is not invariable. For it can happen that something that has been promised and agreed, if carried out, would be disadvantageous to the person to whom the promise has been made, or else to him who gave the promise. If Neptune in the myth had not done what he had promised to Theseus, Theseus would not have been deprived of his son Hippolytus. He made three wishes, as we read, and the third was this: he wished in his anger that Hippolytus would die. When it was granted, he fell into the deepest grief. Therefore, promises should not be kept if they are disadvantageous to those to whom you have made them, nor if they harm you more than they benefit the person to whom you have promised. Is it contrary to duty to prefer the greater good to the lesser? For example, if you had made an appointment to appear for someone as advocate in the near future, and in the meantime your son had fallen seriously ill, it would not be contrary to your duty not to do as you had said. Rather, the person to whom you had made the promise would be failing in his duty if he complained that he had been abandoned. Again, who does not see that if someone is forced to make a promise through fear or deceived into it by trickery, the promise ought not to stand? One is released from such promises in most cases by the praetor's code of justice, and sometimes by the laws. Very interesting talk of promises here and circumstances when duty seems not to be duty. If we think of duty as what ought to be done, how on earth do we have these escape hatches and sort of conditional, well, not under these circumstances, obviously. What do you think, Catherine?
Well, I think this is where Cicero is becoming eminently practical because the the interesting things, the interesting stories about duty are those moments when a person has multiple duties and they conflict. And I mean, the one that springs to mind for me greatest is the story of Coriolanus, who uh, has a duty to the people that he has promised to go and attack Rome. He's a Roman though, and he has a duty to his mother to listen to her. And so there's this question of when will which officium is he going to pick? Um,
Hmm.
and that's from Roman history, but it's also one of Shakespeare's plays. And so those stories keep going because it's that moment of uh I have multiple officia here. Which one do I pick and which one is more important? And so here I think promises are something that, if I remember correctly, even Plato talks about this situation where if if I promise to if someone gives me a sword to keep safely,
Right.
if that person then comes and is temporarily insane and asks the sword from me, I ought not to give it to him, even though I have promised to give it back when he asks.
Right. Right. That's early in Republic. That's one of the refutation of the example that of the proposed definition that justice simply means paying debts, keeping promises, giving what is owed. But obviously, justice is deeper than that because there are some promises that one ought not to repay. But it does seem like Cicero is introducing this kind of sliding scale of circumstances, right? Well, you ought to keep your promises, yes, but not if it would be disadvantageous to the person, nor to you. And that's the one place where my ears pricked up. If you would suffer more harm than you would do
Yeah.
good to the person by keeping the promise, well, obviously the promise is not binding, and it's unjust of him to think that it should be. And that's, I
Well, and
suppose,
it's
because the
interesting to
purpose
me
is to
that
benefit
he,
everybody. Yeah, please.
sorry.
My fault.
Um, yes, and I think that's the key here. The purpose is to benefit everyone. because the example he offers is not a selfish one. The example of I have promised, the reader has promised to be a lawyer for someone, and then cannot because his son has fallen ill and he must go take care of his son. This is not a, oh, I don't feel like it,
Mhm.
or oh, it's inconvenient for me. It is, no, I must go. I have another officium to a closer relative who has a greater claim upon me. And therefore, I have to break this officium temporarily or permanently. And it is incumbent upon that person to recognize that greater claim as part of his officium.
Right. There is always this relationship, isn't there? There's a reciprocity, right? That
Mhm.
my service, the service that I owe is service owed to someone that they receive it. And there are officia, as it seems, or duties, obligations, and correct judgments to be made on both sides.
Hmm. Definitely.
That's great. Was there anything else in here?
Uh,
Wanted to I'm probably mispronouncing the Roman and the Greek names. I hope you will excuse me.
Oh, no worries. There are multiple possible English pronunciations of everything.
Okay, excellent. No, I think we've about covered it here. Of course, the case that promises to be kept are not absolute interests me because the other philosophers would teach just the opposite. I am curious,
Mm.
and I don't know, this will come up at some point later on. Later on in section 39, in his discussion of war, he does consider the fact that a promise made to the enemy in war to deliver oneself in for ransom or whatever must be kept. And maybe we'll talk about that, or whoever is reading for those chapters will talk about that. Is that in conflict with this idea that a promise extorted through fear or a promise that is coerced or tricked need not be kept. It probably has to do something to do with the specific officia that are relevant to warfare, to the duty of a
Hmm.
warrior who has surrendered himself, perhaps to the enemy for some reason, and the deal that he's struck. Why don't we finish with chapter 33, and that'll wrap us up,
All
I
right.
think, for this episode. Would you like to read that one, Catherine?
Certainly. Injustices can also arise from a kind of trickery, by an extremely cunning but ill-intentioned interpretation of the law. In consequence, the saying, the more justice, the less injustice, the more justice, the more injustice, has by now become a proverb well worn in conversation. Many wrongs of this type are committed even in public affairs. An example is that of the man who, during a truce of 30 days, when he had agreed with the enemy, laid waste the fields by night on the grounds that the truce had been established for days, but not for nights. We should not approve the action even of our own countrymen, if the story is true about Quintus Fabius Labeo or some other person, for I know of it only by hearsay. He was assigned by the Senate to arbitrate about the boundary between the Nolani and the Neapolitani. When he arrived at the place, he spoke with each group separately, urging it to do nothing out of covetousness or greed and to be prepared to retreat rather than to advance. When both of them did that, there was some land left in the middle. Therefore, he set a limit to their boundaries exactly where they themselves had said, but he assigned the land that was left in the middle to the people of Rome. That was not arbitration. That was deception. Cleverness of such a kind ought in every case to be avoided. Moreover, certain duties must be observed even toward those at whose hands you may have received unjust treatment. There is a limit to revenge and to punishment. I am not even sure that it is enough simply that the man who did the harm should repent of his injustice, so that he himself will do no such thing again, and others will be slower to act unjustly.
Very good. Thank you. That last bit, I think maybe you left out a word. It's not even sure that it is not enough simply
Oh,
to
yes, I
force
did.
the man to repent.
Whoops.
So, well,
Thank
take
you.
that very last paragraph first. This is a very brief, what, two-sentence treatment of injustice to the wrongdoer. He doesn't say a
Hmm.
lot affirmatively, but you have justice towards somebody who actually has done you injustice. There are limits to the amount of punishment and revenge that you can seek. It is possible to overstep the boundaries of justice, to be excessive, sort of in an Aristotelian way. And then this kind of sort of musing aloud, right? Perhaps it's even enough just to say, look, if you repent of doing injustice, so that sincerely, maybe sort of wholeheartedly, so that you will do no such thing again. And others who see this will see sort of maybe perhaps his shame or his turn of character and would be slower to imitate him to act in justice. Maybe that's enough. He doesn't say a
Mhm.
whole lot more, but that's his sort of concession to the justice owed to the wrongdoer, to the person who has victimized you. Um, would you care to comment on that, or maybe the first half of that chapter as well?
Sure. The the interesting thing with the willingness to take repentance just as that might be enough. Um, I think has several elements here. It's interesting because there's a sense in which the shame that you touched on, that is a real thing. The Romans are very honor conscious, as we've seen even in the early chapters of De Officiis. Um, and so just the shame of having to publicly say, like, I did something and I will never do it again, that is such a that is we not being in a very like honor conscious culture do not have that same kind of feeling that would be there. So I think that it is a stronger punishment than one might think just reading it. And then the other thing is that Caesar, oddly enough, was famous for this. He was well known for being clement, for his clemency, forgiving people who just fought against him. And then they said, "I'm sorry, can I serve you now?" And he said, "Sure, fine."
Hmm.
Now, that didn't turn out too well for him because Brutus and Cassius were two of the people he forgave, but
Right.
this was something that he was known for. And so the clemency here is an interesting little piece that Cicero throws in there.
Hmm.
Um, I think the other thing is the more justice, the more injustice, that proverb that he's got. It's a pun in Latin, and so
Hmm.
uh, the translation has rendered it well, because the word for justice here is um, there's a lot of interesting things that can be done with that. Other translations have done like the more law, the less, the more injustice. So the idea of piling up laws and then you get more problems. Um,
Very good. Well, he gives examples of trickery, right? Injustice
mhm.
by trickery. And we might say at some point we sort of smile and applaud and say, okay, well that's a clever solution to the problem, right? We said you said nights not you said days not nights. This is the kind of what the 12-year-old boy would say if you were negotiating with him. He'd say, "Oh, come on, this is." He says this is not to be praised. This is not the sort of
Right.
thing we should tolerate in a leader, in a king, or anyone. And then, of course, also the example of the claiming the strip in between the two warring armies. This wasn't arbitration. This wasn't the thing that you agreed to do. You've not fulfilled your officia with regard to the duty of being an arbitrator, which is what people trusted you to do. You did something different
Right.
instead, and that's blameworthy, right? That's a violation of duty. It's unjust, right?
And it is unjust no matter the fact that he claimed it for the people of Rome. So just
Mhm.
because he said that he was doing it for the res publica, that doesn't matter.
Mhm.
It's still an unjust thing objectively.
Yeah, that's that's great. This is I'd say Cicero is more and more fun to read as I sort of get deeper into this reading and rereading this text and talking it over with friends like you and Josh. And we will have, I think, a rotating series of hosts and guests. It won't always be me. It won't always be Josh. And I hope it'll be you, Catherine, again sometime soon. But I think we've come to
I'd
the
love
end of
that.
this half hour for the On Duties podcast. I want to thank you all for watching, for listening to us, and we look forward to getting into Cicero's treatment in the next chapters of the nature of justice in warfare. So thanks very much. Bye bye.
Hello, welcome to the On Duties podcast. We're so glad you're joining us again. We're continuing our reading of Cicero on Duties De Officiis. I am joined today. By the way, I'm Josh Bowman, Executive Director of the Ciceronian Society. I've been off for a couple episodes. And you have been graced by the presence of Katherine Bradshaw of the Ancient Language Institute and of Abilene, Texas, as well as Chris Anadale at Mount St. Mary's University. We're so glad you're joining us again. I want to continue to ask you to leave some comments and feedback as you read along with us with Cicero on Duties. We don't know everything. I'm sure there's a bunch of stuff we're missing. So please, chime in, ask us questions. Let us know what you think of this. We appreciate the feedback we've received so far. Please keep it coming. Once again, I also want to invite you to look at our other podcast, The Sower, and consider signing up for the Ciceronian Society's newsletter. There's a lot more there's a lot more than what we are offering you here. I can't talk anymore. We're just going to keep going. I didn't take Cicero's rhetoric classes to not talk over my words, but we are starting in Book 1, Chapter 34. In previous episodes, we began the discussion of justice. We're not done with that yet. And today we're going to start looking at justice in warfare in particular, and then going from there. So I want to invite Katherine to get us started here and read chapter 34 and 35. Oh, by the way, as a reminder, we're using this version. Oh, yeah, Chris, go ahead and hold yours up. It worked better. Katherine has the newer one. This is the Cambridge Text in the History of Political Thought. We're using that translation. So, Katherine, if you could, start us off with chapter 34.
Certainly. Something else that must be very much be preserved in public affairs is the justice of warfare. There are two types of conflict. The one proceeds by debate, the other by force. Since the former is the proper concern of a man, but the latter of beasts, one should only resort to the latter if one may not employ the former. Wars, then, ought to be undertaken for this purpose, that we may live in peace without injustice. And once victory has been secured, those who were not cruel or savage in warfare should be spared. Thus, our forefathers even received the Tusculani, the Aequi, the Volsci, the Sabini, and the Hernici into citizenship. On the other hand, they utterly destroyed Carthage and Numantia. I would prefer that they had not destroyed Corinth, but I believe that they had some specific purpose in doing so, in particular in view of its advantageous situation to prevent the location itself from being someday an incitement to war. In my opinion, our concern should always be for a peace that will have nothing to do with treachery. If I had been followed in this, we would still have some republican government, if perhaps not the very best. Whereas now we have none. And while you must have concern for those whom you have conquered by force, you must also take in those who have laid down their arms and seek refuge in the faith of generals, although a battering ram may have crashed against their wall. In this matter, justice was respected so greatly among our countrymen that the very men who had received into their good faith cities or peoples conquered in war would, by the custom of our forefathers, become their patrons.
Thank you, Katherine. I love when Cicero says something to the effect of, had you just listened to me, everything would be fine. That's a good thing. And we're talking about justice and warfare, and I think you can see here a precursor to what will become the Christian just war theory. It's already in here. I think I think there's appeals to natural law and to duty. There's also so one of the things too here that he's I think is important is he's saying there is something dehumanizing about war, both if you're suffering it and if you're engaging in it. Now, this is not when you think of Rome, you think of violence, you think of war. This is not a peaceful civilization. Pax Romana was the exception, and it's not. And actually, we can talk about that, right? He's kind of hinting at what that Pax is for. But he's associating, being in war as being a beast, which is striking coming from a Roman. And I think it's also encouraging that he's at least moving in that direction. He does not celebrate war, but it's going to be necessary. He's not an idealist in this sense where he thinks that we can avoid it. And he gives these different examples. And so I also think there's something here where, and you may have brought this up in a previous episode, but now that we're talking about war, there's also this change in the way we think of that word officiis, right? That it's not just the offices of the individual to other individuals in relationship to one another. Could it be said, and maybe Katherine, you know more about this in terms of the origin of the word and the etymology than I do, but it could also be said that there's something to the effect of a nation's office relative to other nations, a country's office relative to other countries. Now, the modern notion of the state is an anachronism here, but there are nations, right? There are peoples. And so can you talk about an office of a people in the same way you talk about an office of individuals?
Yeah, and that's a really important point. So the idea that he's talking about, particularly with the last part of 35, where he's talking about how conquered peoples have been sort of received by the victorious generals into their patron network. This is an individual thing. So the patron client network in ancient Rome is the wealthy will be patrons, and there will be less wealthy or freedmen, ex-slaves who are their clients. They will get food or money or something from their patrons, but in exchange for there's an implication that if you run in an election, I will vote for you if you're my
Hmm.
patron. There's um, also just a lot of duties that are both ways here.
Yep.
And that's an individual thing. But then what the word that is for what happens to the conquered enemies when they become part of the patron client network is patronicium. And so this is they're admitted to they become the clients of the general,
Hmm.
even though they're another people group almost. So it gets expanded from the individual level to the we would say international. They would say something like between city states or between peoples.
Right, right. Chris, what are your thoughts on this initially?
Well, I was thinking what you said about, Cicero is a Roman, and here he is talking about limits of warfare, the bestial nature of warfare. But I was thinking to myself, he's also a talker. And he says, look, we prefer talk to fight.
Right.
And if we're going to make the transition, there has to be a certain type of talk that precedes war. That's going to be coming up in the next section, right? We have to say certain things and give certain opportunities to avoid this. And it does look like there's there's something like an ethic of war here. And a question I had really written down about a later section, but I can raise it now. Is Cicero talking about a kind of moral obligation in warfare, or is he merely talking about the kind of duties that apply to a republic, a nation, a people, or the combatants, the generals, the citizens, sort of doing what is appropriate to their office? Do you take what I'm meaning here? Is there specifically sort of moral, ethical question at stake that he is sort of embedding within his discussion of duty here?
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that with a deep confidence, but I think especially as we see later and prior to this, how there are just certain limits. He has a very, in my view, kind of an underlying Aristotelian um, disposition, if you will, right? Don't take this too far. Because there is, and if we can think of the mean, right, the moderation of Aristotle and Cicero as being kind of a moral standard, that he's that there is something to that. So I think it is moral. It's not just strategic. It's not just for instrumental purposes. That there actually is a goal behind it. And I also I like the fact you said he was a talker because if you think about Cicero, no one remembers Cicero for military prowess. That's not his thing. He did have experience there, but it was not positive. He's not. I mean, it was not how he was going to succeed. Let's just put it that way. And I think there's something like, why don't we just leave it to the talkers? Right? I think it's a great point. But anyways, the moral question, Catherine, what are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree and would say that Cicero is certainly building toward the idea that there is a moral obligation here. I think we're going to see that in the exempla, the examples that he puts forward later in later sections, because a lot of those have to do with moral dilemmas and moral questions, particularly about whether one should keep one's word to the enemy or not.
Hmm.
So there is definitely an underlying moral dynamic, and it's not just, well, it's expedient to keep your word because otherwise the other one won't keep his word. It's
Hmm.
definitely a no, you should, you ought to do
Hmm.
this.
Hmm. I think it's just as before we move on, thinking about his comments earlier in chapter 35. On the other hand, they utterly destroyed Carthage and Numantia. That doesn't seem to bother him, or any Roman for
Mhm.
that matter. I would prefer that they had not destroyed Corinth. Do we know what he's talking about here? And I look at the note. He says that Carthage and Corinth, or at least this is the annotations right from the editors. Carthage and Corinth were destroyed in 146 BC, Numantia in 133 BC. Cicero's unease about the destruction of Corinth, condemned later in the book, shows in his sophistic attempt to bring it under the rule that war should be undertaken only to ensure peace when diplomacy is inapplicable. He was reluctant to admit that the imperialism of our forefathers was as ruthless as that of his own time. And so there's always a tendency, if this note is to be believed, if the destruction of Corinth was unnecessary. And again, I don't know the history well enough. Uh, he wants to believe that our forefathers were always better than us, which is also true. We don't want to believe that maybe, just maybe, as Americans as well, like maybe we're not, there's a lot more war today. Our forefathers wouldn't have been as enthusiastic as we are about it, perhaps. But there's some uncomfortable moments, right, in our history, as there are in Roman history. All right, I think we
Yeah.
shope move on then to
Okay.
chapter 36.
Actually, Josh,
Oh
could I
yeah, go
jump in
ahead.
with just one or two more comments about
Yes,
35? I don't want to
go for
delay
it.
us, but I'd made a note about but maybe we've covered this already, but he says that before he talks about mercy towards captives and
Hmm.
sort of the moral reason for that, he doesn't ground it in a kind of utilitarian thing. You need to be merciful to them so that they will be merciful to you, or it's kind
Hmm.
of what we would recognize as a kind of international law as being a kind of standing agreement that none of us will sink below a certain level. He says it's because the purpose of war is to live in peace and to live in peace without injustice. So
Mm.
don't do anything at the end of the war that's going to contaminate the peace with a kind of injustice or cruelty. And that seemed to me to be pretty important in terms of figuring out sort of both the origin and the boundaries of this ethic of warfare that he's leading us towards.
I wonder if there's something to be said about does Cicero have as much of a concept of just peace as he does of just war? I don't know if he would say it that way because I think that's always a part that we don't talk about enough. We talk about just war and just war theory, but what about a just peace, right? What about because you can have peace and injustice. You can have the
Mhm.
lack of conflict, but is it true pax, right?
And this is something that Cicero had to think about quite a bit,
Mhm.
because his negotiations between Caesar and Pompey during the civil war between those two, he says over and over in his letters and things, I'm trying to negotiate peace so we don't have war. Civil war is the worst. We really don't want that. And so he's willing to accept some things that are suboptimal, to put it mildly, in order that we don't have civil war again. Because remember, Cicero is also thinking about, you had Marius and Sulla, you
Hmm.
had bunches of civil wars before Caesar and Pompey.
Hmm.
So you have all of that going into it. And the question of Carthage and Numantia and Corinth gets into the different types of war that we'll talk about later as
Yeah.
well. So those definitely get brought up. Corinth, the Romans are kind of uncomfortable with generally, but Carthage and Numantia are also debatable. And the fact that Cicero lands and says, no, that was fine to destroy Carthage and Numantia, does say something about the Carthaginians, particularly. And we'll get into more of that later, I think.
Right. Carthago delenda est, right? Is that how I say it?
Semper
Yeah.
Carthago
Carthago.
delenda est.
Carthago delenda. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Chris, how about you continue with reading? It looks like chapter 36.
Yeah.
Let's go through the end of that next paragraph where the one that ends with the word enemy.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. It's on page 15 of this text. So, indeed, a fair code of warfare has been drawn up in full accordance with religious scruple in the fetial laws of the Roman people. From this, we can grasp that no war is just unless it is waged after a formal demand for restoration, or unless it has been formally announced and declared beforehand. When Popilius was general in charge of a province, Cato's son was serving as a novice soldier in his army. Popilius then decided to dismiss one of the legions, and included in the dismissal the young Cato, who was serving in that legion. But when, out of love of fighting, he remained in the army, Cato wrote to Popilius saying that if he allowed him to stay in the army, he should bind him by a fresh military oath, since he could not in justice fight the enemy when his former oath had become void. Such was their extreme scrupulousness when making war. So I go into chapter 37 then.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Okay. There actually exists a letter of the elder Marcus Cato to the younger Marcus, in which he writes that he has heard that his son, who was serving in Macedonia in the war against Perseus, had been discharged by the consul. He warns him, therefore, to be careful not to enter battle, for he says, it is not lawful for one who is not a soldier to fight with the enemy.
That's really interesting. It's a very different, first of all, it sounds like in ancient Rome, at least at this point, you could be a soldier, but it was never a permanent situation. You were not a lifelong, I mean, there certainly were lifelong soldiers. I mean, Caesar for all intents and purposes, but there certainly is a sense in which it is a temporary position in which the oath has a timestamp, if you will. I thought this was a curious footnote or an interesting footnote here, because this chapter 36 begins with an allusion to the way Rome would declare war. And this says, the old Roman practice was for the priesthood of the fetiales to deliver an ultimatum to the enemy, demanding compensation for his alleged oppression. If no satisfaction was forthcoming, a threat of war was announced, and war was then formally declared by the Roman assembly. Cicero, or here is inexact. He means all three conditions to apply, essentially: the assembly, the rebuttal of the offer, and what the priests offer. It's interesting here because, as with everything in ancient Rome, there is no, the idea of a separation of, for lack of a better word, church and state is not a thing, right? The religious rights, the state, they're all together. There's no distinction. And so when it's an announcement of war, it's the priests who do it, even though they don't really have a say in the decision so much, but they are part of the process because it's religious. Is this because we're not, and again, I doubt that this is actually what Cicero is saying, but was there a Roman belief that when we go to war with another nation, we're not just fighting their people, we're fighting their gods? Is that is that part of what's going on here, or is that overstating it?
It depends on which period you're talking about and which people you're talking about.
Okay.
In the ancient world, there is a sense in which the gods fight with each other when the states go to war. Cicero is, because he's very much in the Aristotelian tradition and in the skeptical, he's one of the descendants of the Peripatetics.
Mm-hmm.
So the Aristotelian school that doesn't really like saying anything for certain.
Yeah.
So he'll say, we're more sure about this. We're not fully sure, but we're more sure. So I doubt that Cicero would have said, well, our gods are going to war with their gods. But
Right.
This is an idea that's very much in the water in Rome. There's also the sense that the gods are watching over any sort of oath, and the declaration of war by the Fetiales involved an oath that one of the Fetiales would swear, we are going to war for just causes. So the gods are involved in everything for the Romans.
Yeah, that fits with my reading. I mean, the text I know most closely is Fustil de Coulanges, The Ancient City, which is a great text, but about a much older period with influences that sort of echo down through the ages, even into the time of Cicero. But it does seem to me it's important that it start with a religious event and a sort of religious authority. One, that's the highest authority. And two, it tells the enemy, we're actually serious about this. This is not a bluff. This is not a negotiating tactic, right? This is we are calling upon our gods in the name of our gods that, in the sight of all the divinities, you have offended us and we demand satisfaction. It's we still see, of course, traces of that in our own culture. People swear an oath to tell the truth in the sight of God. And that's that. And there's also, I think, I was thinking also, we still have this kind of perhaps by now quaint tradition of expecting Congress to declare war on behalf of the American people before we engage in some kind of aggression against a foreign state. But that also seems to be that there has to be some kind of solemn declaration, that's both religious and political, that sort of before we get to the sort of bestial, sort of the lowest level bestial actual work of smashing each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I also think does this make war more total in a way in the Roman sense? I don't know if that's the right word, because I'm trying to think of how the Roman notion of warfare is changing, and it's still going to change more, but this this also you can see how this is going to tie to the divine status of the emperor as well, it being a part of this military complex. It's different than today so much of the American military industrial complex is sustained by its economic uh, the fact that war is lucrative, at least for some
Mhm.
people, but not for the majority. Back then, you could still say that to a point, but it's certainly not to the extent it is today. And so instead, that religious aspect would sustain it. Um, and how seriously did they take that?
Well, it depends again on the time period because when
Hmm.
Cicero's writing, they don't actually use the fetiales that much. The fetiales fall out of use, and then Augustus actually brings them back in to declare war on Cleopatra.
Hmm.
And so to invest himself with that, I'm going back to the traditions of the ancestors. Cicero kind of glosses over the fact that the Romans don't really use the fetiales that much by the time that he's writing.
Yeah.
But I to get to your question, Josh, I'm not so war in the ancient world is kind of total by definition because
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
all the spoils go to the victor and there's no sense of an agreed upon, well, we'll do prisoner exchanges. It's very much up to the general and all of that. So there's an arbitrariness, I think, that makes the war more total a lot of the time, as opposed to um, more modern warfare in the sense of the ones that are influenced by Christian just war theory, where there is an anticipation, at least, or an expectation that there will be some mercy shown.
Hmm. If you guys are okay, why don't we move on to the rest of chapter 37? Katherine, if you could read that, just starting at the top of that one paragraph, a further point, and then going to the end of chapter 37.
Certainly. So this is on page 16. A further point is that the name given to someone who ought properly to have been called a foe, per duellis, is in fact hostis. I notice that the grimness of the fact is lessened by the gentleness of the word, for hostis meant to our forefathers he whom we now call a stranger. The 12 tables show this. For example, a day appointed for trial with a hostis, and again, right of ownership cannot be alienated in favor of a hostis. What greater courteousness could there be than to call him against whom you are waging war by so tender a name? Long usage, however, has made the name harsher, for the word has abandoned the stranger and now makes its proper home with him who bears arms against you.
This, so I confess I'm a little lost here. First of all, whenever you read Latin, it sounds like you're speaking Elvish. That's a compliment. It just
Thank
sounds
you.
way cooler than when I say it. Hostis, per duellis, that's how I do it. Maybe it's because I tried refreshing my Latin on Duolingo. Let me tell
Uh-huh.
you how much that's a bad idea.
Oh dear.
I'm enjoying myself. It actually is it's
Uh-huh.
funny at times. So I don't recommend it though. I recommend the Ancient Language Institute, fully endorsed. That's certainly here.
Thank you.
But Catherine? What's he trying to do here? Like why? This is very much an exercise in Latin, right? This is
Mhm.
we've changed the word. Uh,
Yeah.
that we've gone from stranger. Is it that he's saying we've gone from stranger to foe?
What he's saying here is that the word that they use for foe hostis, is a word that originally meant stranger, which is by the time Cicero is writing this, the word they use for that is peregrinus, not hostis. And so, but he says because it originally was like a euphemism, and then we kept using that euphemism to the point that we no longer use the word hostis to mean anything except for enemy. And so
Hmm.
it no longer is a euphemism.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, Chris, your thoughts on there before we conclude.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes along with the religion idea is that, it was the case that our ancestors, the 12 tables, regarded the enemy as sort of having a dignity of the stranger, right? He's not our existential foe who needs to be destroyed and exterminated and have the land plowed with salt, although it may come to that. But they use the same sort of legal term that they would use to describe, a foreigner living among us whom you can't sell property to or the like. So it's just a matter of saying what I'm saying here is not some sort of philosophical revolution in Roman practice. I'm just
Mhm.
talking about the way in which our better and the better instincts of our ancestors reflected in our language sadly now decline so that the word hostis now is used to refer to somebody bearing arms against you. But I think he's just pointing to, he's linking up with tradition, isn't he? And saying, the best of what Rome has been is reflected in the kind of rule of war that I'm describing now.
Mhm.
I really like that. I like the fact that Cicero always brings us back to what do words mean, right? That it makes me think of Tolkien in that respect, where we take for granted how life experience, our environment, all these things, they shape the words that we use, and the words we use shape it in return, right? There is a sense in which how we talk about this is going to shape how we respond, how we act, etc. So, well, Katherine and Chris, thank you so much for this great episode. We're going to come back again here shortly next week and do another episode for episode 8 on we're going to continue this talk about justice and war, justice to the enemy, as we move on. So thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the On Duties podcast with the Ciceronian Society. I'm Josh Bowman, Executive Director of the Ciceronian Society. I'm joined by my friends Katherine Bradshaw with the Ancient Language Institute and Chris Anadale of Mount St. Mary's University. We're so glad you're joining us on this adventure through Cicero's On Duties, his most influential work and arguably his most widely read throughout history. Incredibly important text that is unfortunately underread in our present time. So we're glad you're joining us. We're reading from the Cambridge Text in the History of Political Thought edition, and that translation in particular. Speaking of translations, back in episode 3, we came to book 1, chapter 13. And I'm just going to read this in English, the passage we came to on the top of page 7. It says, consequently, Cicero says, we understand that what is true, simple, and pure is most fitted to the nature of man. In addition to this desire for seeing the truth, there is a kind of impulse towards preeminence, so that a spirit that is well trained by nature will not be willing to obey for its own benefit someone whose advice, teaching, and commands are not just and lawful. Greatness of spirit and a disdain for human things arise as a result. You may recall back in that episode, and this is before we get into chapter 38 here shortly. Back in that episode, I asked the question about what the translation there is, because is he essentially kind of taking a Platonic, at least in one way to read Plato, disdain for or contempt for physical things, for history, for time, for all the imminent, the particular, right? Is that where he's going with this? My suspicion is that that's not the case, but we have Katherine with us who knows how to speak Latin, and so I'm wondering, Katherine, now that we have you here, can you go back to that translation and tell us what does he mean by disdain in this case?
Sure. So and for our listeners, I'm looking at the Loeb Classical Library edition of On Duties that has the Latin in it. So the word that gets translated as disdain in the Cambridge is contempt, and that
I'm
word,
sorry, Catherine, could you say it again? I think your video froze just a moment. The Latin
oh
is
dear.
what?
So the word is contemptio, and that word has a range of meaning that goes from despising, disregard, contempt, scorn, disdain. So any of those is a perfectly acceptable translation. But contextually here, because he talks about greatness of spirit or greatness of soul, it's magnitudo animi in the Latin. It's that I would be inclined to say that this is about the disdain or scorn is more in the sense of not valuing it highly. It's not a platonic, oh, the material is
It's
not to
bad.
be
Yeah.
is to be rejected
Hmm.
completely. It's more that the person with a great soul will not consider the things that are physical or this worldly to be the highest good, and so will find glory and honor and doing the right thing higher priorities than his own wealth or prosperity.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's such a it's kind of a limitation of the English language that we don't necessarily make that distinction. I mean, you were saying earlier that just like the passage, and again, I can't remember where this is either. The bad Protestant I am, where Jesus says, "Unless you hate your father and mother," right. He doesn't mean literally hate your father and mother, but in English, that's our best translation. It's something similar to this, where it's like, look,
Mhm.
and this is certainly a Christian view that we we sure we love our mother and father. We're told to honor your father and mother, right? But not above and beyond our Lord, right? There is something to be said there. So, well, I don't want to dwell on that too much, but I just want to encourage our listeners and viewers, whenever you run into questions about the translation or about how we're looking at that, please go ahead and comment down below. We love those questions; those are interesting, and as long as Catherine's around, we'll be able to answer them. Chris and I cannot do so. So, but we will lean on her as we have many times before. All right, Chris, if you could, we're going to start back up in this episode. This is episode 8, and we are going to start at chapter 38, book 1 of Cicero on Duties. If you could go ahead and read that, Chris.
Sure, we're at the bottom of page 16 of the Cambridge version. When, then, we are fighting for empire and seeking glory through warfare, those grounds that I mentioned a little above as just grounds for war should be wholly present. But wars in which the goal is the glory of empire are waged less bitterly. For just as in civilian matters we may compete in one way with an enemy, in another with a rival, for the latter contest is for honor and standing, the former for one's civic life or reputation. Similarly, the wars against the Celtiberi and the Cimbri were waged with enemies. The question was not who would rule, but who would exist. With the Latins, Sabini, Samnites, Carthaginians, and Pyrrhus, on the other hand, the dispute was over empire. The Carthaginians were breakers of truces, and Hannibal was cruel, but the others were more just. Indeed, Pyrrhus's words about the returning of the captives were splendid. And this is a long block quote. My demand is not for gold, nor shall you give me a price. Let us each determine our lives by iron, not by gold, not by selling, but by fighting war. Let us test by our virtue whether Mistress Fortune wishes you or me to reign, or what she may bring. Hear these words too. If the fortune of war spares the virtue of any, take it as certain that I shall spare them their liberty. Take them as a gift, and I give them with the will of the great gods. That is certainly the view of a king, and one worthy of the race of the Achaeadae. I'm sorry,
Right.
Acidae.
Well, how are you supposed to say it, Catherine?
Uh, Ayakidai.
Wow,
Ayacadae. Thank
wow,
you.
you weren't even close.
Nope, nowhere
Uh,
near.
There are many
that's
ways
not.
to pronounce things.
Yeah, that's not how I would have. That's not how I would have pronounced it either, Chris. That was great. I'm. Yeah. So again, I think this makes me think back to our previous episode about how when the Romans went to war, again, it was just a formality, but historically, when they went to war, they would rely on the priest to essentially give the enemy, the those who you're about to attack or defend yourself against, a chance to talk it out. And if they didn't, you could go to war. So there was a religious aspect to the battle. And this makes a distinction, if I'm understanding it right, and I'm not sure I am. There's wars for glory, and I wonder about the use of the word empire here. That's an interesting choice. Uh, Wars for glory and who's going to rule, and wars for survival. Right? It's one thing to decide who's going to be in charge now, and another thing to say who's going to not who's going to exist after this, because back then, they don't have this concept of sovereignty. They don't have a concept of, as far as I can understand, I guess, um, the way we think of, states and nations as having sovereignty and borders and things like that. And so, how do you determine who's in charge over this particular geographic area? It's essentially the will of the stronger or the will of the smarter. And the gods, because they're overseeing these battles, will make sense of that. And so that distinction has to be weird to the modern reader. It's like if we're just I hate to bring this example because it's so stupid, but if the United States and Canada wanted to fight it out, you know, just to see who's going to be in charge of North America, that might make sense to a Roman audience because it's like, well, the gods will decide who's going to be in charge of North America through that battle. We would rightly think that's insane today, but back then, there is a concept in which, look, it's almost like animals and mating rituals, right? Like who's going to be in charge of all the women in this harem? That's a really weird example, but it's also what I had in mind thinking here. Um, this is random. I had in mind a nature documentary I saw recently with walruses. So right now, in my mind, the Roman Empire is a walrus. Um, Take that for what you will, listener. Take that for what this is the high quality content you tune into the Ciceronian Society for. All right, so Chris, why don't we go back to you? Save me from my immaturity here. And how do you look at this particular passage?
Well, well, I do wonder, maybe there's a historical question here about whether Cicero regards republic and empire as being incompatible, because he's
Hmm.
speaking about wars for empire and he's speaking about the sort of the past, some past battles as well. But he is making a distinction between existential warfare and warfare for glory, for love of fighting, for advantage, for utilitarian purposes. Differences between who will rule, which has more the character kind of a domestic conflict, we might
Hmm.
say, in terms of our own politics, and who will live, who will
Yeah.
survive, right? So wars that might end in the extermination or the subjugation or absorption of an entire people. And his suggestion is for these latter kind of wars, you still have to have all the conditions for a just war, right? Including the expectation of a just peace. Wars for the glory of empire are, he says, are waged less bitterly. And I was expecting a normative word there. I was expecting him to say they should be waged less bitterly, but he seems to
Mm.
to phrase it here just as a descriptive fact, right? If we're fighting for empire, look, we're not willing to go all the way, to the wall for this. We're not willing to kill and to be killed, in extreme numbers. It's more like a rivalry. But he does plainly leave room for wars of extermination, of which there are some, in living memory,
Mhm.
in historical memory at his time. So he's not ruling out certain kinds of extremes of warfare, it seems.
Catherine, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and also that the translation of empire. Does that make sense?
Oh yes. So imperium, which is the word that he's using, is where we get our word empire. But
Hmm.
for the Romans, up until really we start having official emperors, so not even Augustus, we're talking post Augustus. Imperium just means authority over something,
Mm.
dominion, command, control, the right or power of something. We even would say sovereignty, perhaps.
Okay.
Um, So the idea of a republic having an imperium is completely normal. Even generals are given imperium over their soldiers. That's why they're called imperatores. They're called
Hmm.
commanders.
Is there a relationship between that? I don't know if there's an etymological one. It doesn't look like it, but the way you just described imperium almost sounded to me like the whole idea of a paterfamilias of ancient Rome, right? Is it you can rather than becoming a paterfamilias simply biologically or through adoption or something or marriage, you become kind of the paterfamilias of a given area by winning this war for glory. Is that taking it too far?
It's a little different because the pater familias, the head of household, has what's called the patria potestas. He has
Hmm.
the paternal power. So that's power. Like it's a slightly different word. Imperium is usually a military command. So there's a sense of um, power, but it's power that has kind of a military force behind it. Whereas
Hmm.
Patria Potestas, there is some element of violence in there, at least early on, but
Hmm.
eventually it just becomes, well, the Pater Familias is the decision maker and head of
Hmm.
household.
Hmm.
So
All right.
slightly different. But the the interesting thing with Cicero here is he says that the wars he picks as examples are kind of surprising for these categories. The Cimbri and the Celtiberi, those make sense. Those are wars of survival in the Roman mind.
Hmm.
Um, but the fact that he puts the Punic Wars in war for empire territory instead of war for survival territory is interesting because it shows kind of a disconnect between his view of that war and possibly Cato the Elder, the guy who said Carthago delenda est,
Hmm.
um, his view, because there is a sense in which Hannibal was an existential threat to Rome.
Hmm.
So it's odd that he puts Hannibal there. It seems like he's putting Hannibal there to kind of make a bigger distinction between Hannibal and Pyrrhus, the guy that is quoted so extensively here.
Hmm.
Because Pyrrhus was a noble enemy and Hannibal was a cruel enemy. Uh, and the Carthaginians are so notorious for breaking treaties that there's actually a proverb in Rome, punica fides, Punic trustworthiness, which means treachery.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just note that he had said previously, at the end of the war, you spare the enemies who were not cruel during the war. He's
Mhm.
thinking plainly, I think, of the examples like that. The Carthaginians, look, they were cruel. They crossed the line. That's it for them. No mercy for them.
Right.
Yeah. It's really, I mean, thinking of actions in war and thinking of what comes next. I mean, there is a sense in which uh, strategically you want to if I survive this fight, I want to be treated well, right? If I'm going to be a POW, I want to make sure that they at least feed me,
Mhm.
which is interesting. Um, Again, it kind of goes back to I can't remember if it was this episode or last one about Cicero favoring a just peace as in addition to a just war. So if you all are ready, why don't we move on to chapter 39? And
Mhm.
Catherine, could you read that for us?
Certainly. If any individuals have been constrained by circumstance to promise anything to an enemy, they must keep faith, even in that. Indeed, Regulus did so when he was captured by the Carthaginians in the First Punic War and was sent to Rome for the purpose of arranging an exchange of captives, having vowed that he would return. For first of all, upon his arrival, he proposed in the Senate that the captives should not be returned. And then, when his friends and relatives were trying to keep him, he preferred to go back to his punishment than to break the faith he had given to the enemy.
All right. Um, yes, like even if you have to make a promise under duress, essentially, uh, you got to keep it. And he gives this example of Regulus. I don't know. So he proposed to in the Senate that the captive should not be returned. And then when his friends and relatives were trying to keep him, he preferred to go back to his punishment than to break the faith he had given to an enemy. Um, that's just really interesting. It's like you have to keep your promise when you could have escaped.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um, there's other stories of this in the ancient world, I think. And I
This is the
also,
most famous
yeah, okay.
in the Roman world, at least. And this is one of my favorites, as a, like the Roman exemplum of or example of this idea, because Regulus, so Cicero before said that we should not keep promises if they harm the person we promised to, or if they harm us way more than they harm someone else.
Hmm.
Right. That was
Um,
back in chapter
and
32. We spoke about that. Yeah.
right, but Regulus is not an example of this. Regulus is the commander of the Roman forces for this particular battle that he lost, and is told by the Carthaginians, you have to negotiate a prisoner exchange, or we will, and you must come back if you don't. And so actually a lot of Romans say this is a promise extracted by force. You don't have to abide by it. And Regulus says, no, this is my honor. I'm going to go back. I'm going to do this. And he dies by sleep deprivation because the Carthaginians basically torture him to death when he gets back. And he knows that. He knows what the Carthaginians are like, and he goes back anyway.
So does he go back for the sake of honor? He feels that he has given his word. He, as an honorable man, now has this officium to even to the enemy, not extracted under force, right? Or torment, not because it's disadvantageous. Is this just a matter of the duty of honor trumping the base duty that sort of the more basic level duty that we'd spoken about in back in chapter 32?
I think this is also partially because he is a commander. He has the imperium. And
Mhm.
so as that, he is a representative of the Roman people. And so I think it's more than just personal. It's he feels the weight of the entire Roman people on his shoulders, is the
Mhm.
sense that I get from various tellings of the story.
Okay. Well, he also advises the Senate not to do the prisoner exchange, which would save his life. He puts the national interest
Right,
over his own survival, and then walks back into certain death
right.
for the sake of honor. I can see why this is so memorable and so admirable for and among the Romans and their fans.
Yeah.
When it gets to,
Particularly since he's young, he's older, and the prisoners are young. That's why he says you should not make the exchange because I only have a few years left, and these are very able men who will fight against Rome later.
hmm,
Sorry, Josh.
no, you're fine. It's a really interesting example, and also because Cicero, several episodes ago, we discussed how Cicero's trying to make distinctions between what is honorable and dishonorable, but also what is beneficial and not beneficial. D- So in this sense, Regulus is not doing something that's beneficial to him in one sense, right? I mean, but he certainly is doing something that's beneficial to the people of Rome, um, so that they, yeah. I mean, it's striking, but it's in that sense, Cicero is saying like, look, um, we honor this man because he chose what is honorable and he chose what is beneficial, maybe not to himself, but to the Republic. That's what makes him different, a true patriot, right? Um, why don't we move on to chapter 40? Chris, if you could read that, actually just read to the end of that the paragraph that starts chapter 41.
Sure will. That's to the end of enough about the duties of war.
Yeah, that one.
Yep, you got it. In the Second Punic War, after the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal sent to Rome 10 men, bound by a solemn oath that they would return if they did not succeed in arranging for those whom the Romans had captured to be ransomed. The censors disenfranchised all of them for the rest of their lives, on the grounds that they had broken their oath. They treated similarly one of them who incurred blame by fraudulently evading his solemn oath. For after leaving the camp with Hannibal's permission, he returned a little later, saying that he had forgotten something or other. He then considered that he had released himself from his oath on leaving the camp, but he had done so only in word and not in fact. For on the question of keeping faith, you must always think of what you meant, not of what you said. Another very great example of justice towards an enemy was established by our forefathers when a deserter from Pyrrhus promised the Senate that he would kill the king by giving him poison. Fabricius and the Senate returned him to Pyrrhus. In this way, they did not give approval to the killing of, in a criminal way, of even a powerful enemy and one who was waging war unprovoked. Enough has been said about the duties of war.
Cicero the lawyer here, right? It's not. Listen, he said this, but what he really meant was, I find this entertaining. It's their convenient. I don't know if it's twisting, but he has a point here, in a way, because when you make an oath and you mean it, um, especially if the gods are involved. I mean, well, let me take a step back. I mean, to what extent in kind of a Roman religion does that distinction take place, right? I actually don't know the answer to that. Where if you say I promise to do X, but really you promise and you really meant Y. I promise Y, right? Do the gods hold you to account for what you said or what you meant? Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Would in the Roman religious context, is that really um what's going on there?
It's a debate in the ancient world. It's a
Okay.
big debate actually, because way later Cicero is going to return to this question, and he's going to quote from Euripides, if I remember correctly, or Aeschylus, one of the great tragedians, and he says there's a character who says, "I swore with my tongue, but not with my heart."
Hmm.
And Cicero says that's a cop out. You can't do that.
Huh.
You can't just say, "Oh, I said it, but I didn't mean it." You have to abide by it.
But this is different in war, apparently, for Cicero.
No, no, he's saying it's the same thing because he's actually dispraising the man who says, "Oh, I forgot something, so I returned to
Oh, okay.
camp." He's
Mhm.
saying that was a bad thing. That man should not have done that. He
Right.
should have. He's saying the 10 should have gone back.
Okay.
They
Okay.
should have been like Regulus.
I
And actually,
misread
one
that.
of the censors who disenfranchised those 10 men was the son of Regulus.
Wow.
That's a cool fact.
That's very
Yeah.
cool.
So I mean, you can imagine him going, "My father was in exactly the same situation and went back. I have no sympathy for you all."
Hmm. It's really interesting. I don't in this way think about the Pyrrhus example then as well.
Mhm.
Um I'm not sure I quite follow him here. So they they don't actually kill. So does he actually does the deserter actually kill the king in this case?
No, so the Cicero assumes that his reader is very familiar with this story, and so he sort of just references it without actually telling it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
he'll tell it again on page 132 in book three. Sorry to
Hmm.
yes.
jump in there.
No, that's helpful because the deserter says, If you want me to, I will kill King Pyrrhus for you because I have access to him." And Fabricius is the Roman general. Fabricius says, "No, absolutely not. In fact, I'm going to put this deserter in chains and send him back to Pyrrhus and say, 'This is what happened. Do with him what you want.'"
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yep.
Because we want to conquer Pyrrhus by in an honorable way, not in a underhanded, deceitful way.
Well, as we close here, then I'm wondering what we make of Cis because he's going to come back to questions of war, right? I think he does come back later. Um, but he started out. I mean, in this whole conversation of justice and injustice, and he's gonna in our next episode we'll talk about injustice by force and deceit. That'll be in the next theme as well as some other things. But it's curious to me, underlying all this seems to be a sense of kind of a Ciceronian natural law that there is a it's not he's not looking toward Machiavelli in the way Machiavelli is going to portray these or answer these questions later on. It's not all about survival. It's not all about just winning, right? That there are moral consequences to how you treat your enemies, how you treat the stranger, how you treat the foe, how you wage war, how you wage peace, for lack of a better word. Is that, I mean, just as we close this little section here, is that how you read it as well?
Absolutely. There's a sense in which, because again, he's writing to his son, and his son is young and has done some things, but is still becoming the man that he will be later. And so Cicero is saying, no, be this kind of person, not this other kind of person. That's what all these examples are for. Be like these people. Don't be like these people. There is a moral component that is what will shape your character in the Aristotelian sense of virtue being a habit.
Hmm. Chris?
Well, I think absolutely you're right, and it's interesting, of course, also that rather than giving us a lot of moral theory or a set of rules to follow, he gives us all of these examples, right? Very memorable ones. In fact, ones that your heart swells. You think, wow, what a really admirable thing to do. I would like to be that person. It's already sort of engaging my desire to be better and nobler. And so he's also, I think, here linking up with this idea that, the Romans are very good people. And when they were offered an opportunity to eliminate a key enemy who was fighting a war unprovoked, perhaps even with great cruelty, perhaps even an existential threat, though I don't know the details of that, they immediately disdained, right, sort of rose above the whole idea that we would actually send an assassin after him or take this guy's filthy deal. In fact, like you said, put him in chains, send him back to Pyrrhus to kill him himself, because this man's sort of far beneath the kind of honor that Romans should bring to their international affairs and including warfare.
Hmm. This is all really good stuff. Just thinking about this, as well from uh, a Christian perspective of love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. There's something higher than winning. There's something higher than um, simply making sure your enemies are crying, right? Cry harder, enemy. That's not the Christian perspective. It doesn't seem to be Cicero's perspective either, although there's certainly more room for the going on the offense here in Cicero's case, and just in the Roman case generally. And I also like the fact that Cicero's knowledge of history and his attention to it and use of it is instructive, right? So much of Roman history and Greek history for him is parable, right? This is how we learn what we're doing. He's going to give you, maybe principles and quotable pieces, but in this book as well as his other writings, it's look at this person and emulate them. Just like you said, Chris, don't look over here at this person and don't emulate them, right? The focus on examples is so encouraging, and it gives us. I mean, this is a theme of the Ciceronian Society, right? The theme of tradition. Tradition is that story of mistakes and triumphs, of success and failure. For each of us individually and for our civilization as a whole. Well, Katherine and Chris, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate this. We are going to continue reading Cicero's On Duties. We have some more guests lined up, some new ones, some old ones. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy what comes next. Please keep reading along with us. Take a look at our other podcast, The Sower, and be sure to sign up for our newsletter and take a look at more of what the Ciceronian Society is doing. We'd love to have you along for the ride. There's much more from where this came from. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Wednesday.
Welcome back to the On Duties podcast. This is episode 9. The podcast is a production of the Ciceronian Society. We are reading through Cicero's work On Duties, chapter by chapter, with a half-hour episode every Wednesday throughout 2026. So we hope you'll read with us. A link to the version we're using, the Griffin-Atkins translation from Cambridge, is in the show notes below the description of this episode. There's also a link to a free online translation, slightly different, but you can still follow with us. So we hope you'll join us through the remainder of this podcast. Go back and start listening at the beginning if you wish. We'd be happy to have you join us and share your comments and ideas with us as we go through this important text by Cicero. I am Chris Anadale. I teach philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University in Maryland. Joining me today for the first time on the podcast is my friend, Dr. Ethan Alexander-Davey of Campbell University. Ethan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Chris. I teach political theory and constitutional law at Campbell University, and today I was teaching Hobbes, so it's quite a joy to talk about Cicero after the unpleasantness of human nature that one encounters in Hobbes.
Well, I've remarked before that that Machiavelli certainly sets up sort of targets among moderns, targets Cicero for a great deal of his criticism. And Hobbes, certainly a radically different vision of political theory, of the origin of the state, the nature of political ethics, right?
Indeed.
Indeed.
The virtue ethics versus not.
Right, right. So we have read through with the help of some of our previous guests, Josh Bowman and Katherine from the previous episodes, the episodes on the chapters in the book on justice. So we're just coming to the end. We've gotten up through chapter 40 of book 1 of On Duties. We're just about at the end of his treatment of justice proper. We're about to get into Cicero's treatment of the other half of social virtue, not justice proper, but liberality or generosity. That is the actions that we take because of our justice, according to each person and that the station of each person in order to fulfill our duties. So we'll begin here with chapter 41. This is on page 18 of our translation. Ethan, I think I'll read first, and we'll take turns doing commentary, working through the next few chapters.
Sounds good.
Thanks. Enough has been said about the duties of war. Let us remember also that justice must be maintained even towards the lowliest. The lowliest condition and fortune is that of slaves. The instruction we are given to treat them as if they were employees is good advice, that one should require work from them and grant to them just treatment. There are two ways in which injustice may be done, either through force or through deceit, and deceit seems to belong to a little fox, force to a lion. Both of them seem most alien to a human being, but deceit deserves a greater hatred. And out of all injustice, nothing deserves punishment more than that of men who, just at the time when they are most betraying trust, act in such a way that they might appear to be good men. I have now said enough about justice. So that's book 1, chapter 41 of On Duties. Ethan, what are your comments on that? What do you think?
Yeah, well, you just mentioned how Machiavelli is in dialogue with Cicero here, and that's something we need to mention. But what's the first thing here is that, and we'll see more about this in the later passages, is that for Cicero, we owe something to everyone. So even slaves deserve some kind of justice, and that's not something to dismiss there, right? So he says that we should treat our slaves as though they were hired workers, which means they have some dignity that we ought to respect if we can. And again, we'll see later on that he sets up a sort of a hierarchy about what we owe to different sorts of people depending on their status and depending on their relations with us. And then, right, his denunciation of the fox-like character who relies on deception, who pretends to be good. And of course, this is the very behavior that Machiavelli recommended in The Prince. Be a fox when necessary and be a lion when necessary. But for Cicero, to be a fox is ignoble, is hateful, to pretend to be something that you're not, and especially to pretend to be good when you are not. So the manipulative politician for Cicero deserves the greater hatred here. I think that's significant as well.
Right. I think you're exactly right on both scores. I think I noted here, my first thought was the treatment of justice towards slaves is handled in a single sentence. And I thought at first, well, it's a bit hard on the slaves. On the other hand, one might say, well, what more is there to say other than you must treat them with a minimum level of justice? They too deserve this sort of place in the community. So the Roman practice of allowing them to be killed with impunity, to be punished arbitrarily, is inappropriate. They should be treated like employees. Without going into a large scale ethical critique of the institution of slavery, this seems like Cicero just stating what would be, a kind of common, I'll say common wisdom, but a uh, a general attitude of one must maintain justice even towards the lowly. If one treats them below a certain standard, one has offended justice, even though there's no power behind the institution of the slave to strike back at you or to defend them. So that
Right.
seems like it fits in with the sort of stoic idea of a community of humanity.
Indeed.
And I think you're quite right also about the um, the treatment of deceit. He doesn't really go out of his way to justify this, except to say that both of these are bad, but the more hateful one, the more anti-human one, is the one that puts up the pretense, right? That lies to you as well as doing violence to you, as well as offending justice, sort of offends honesty and sort of breaks faith with the human race maybe twice instead of just once. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that's fair. But and the other thing that occurred to me is that again, this is the old honor ethic that to be open about what one is doing is more honorable than to deceive. So I think there's maybe owes something to that old warrior code, perhaps that is part of, or maybe the more primitive version of the kind of honor that Cicero is promoting.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. That reminds me of something Nietzsche says about
Yes, I
the
was thinking about
nobility.
Nietzsche too.
Nobility would address each other as we truthful ones, we ones who don't have to deceive, who don't lower ourselves to lie about the violence that we do. So interesting. It's certainly not a Nietzschean, but someone who's looking at a sort of similar honor-based understanding of the solidarity between human beings. Ethan, why don't you pick up chapter 42 and we'll talk about that next.
Yes. Next, I must do as I proposed and speak about beneficence and liberality. Nothing is more suited to human nature than this, but there are many caveats. For first, one must see that kindness harms neither the very people whom one seems to be treating kindly, nor others. Next, that one's kindness does not exceed one's capabilities, and then that kindness is bestowed upon each person according to his standing. Indeed, that is fundamental to justice, to which all these things ought to be referred. For those who do someone a favor in such a way that they harm him whom they appear to want to assist should be judged neither beneficent nor liberal, but dangerous flatterers. Those who, in order to be liberal towards some, harm others, fall into the same injustice as if they had converted someone else's possessions to their own account.
Okay, thank you. If I could take first comment on this, we're moving now from justice into liberality or generosity, the kind of actions that follow upon justice that sort of act out one's duties, one's officia towards other people. It'll obviously be dependent upon who those other people are and who I am. But we get, in a sense, three different varieties, three different warnings about beneficence in this opening chapter. First, do no harm. Second, don't exceed your own capacities. Don't give more than you ought, given who you are and the resources that you have. And then lastly, perhaps most importantly, which he'll take the most time to talk about in the coming chapters, give to each person according to their standing. So we don't give equally, we don't feel equally beneficent to everyone because we don't owe an equal obligation of justice to everyone. We owe duties, the duties that, and paying what is needful to each person depends upon our relationship to each of those people. Do you have any thoughts to follow on that?
Well, I do, but I wanted to start by introducing some broader characteristics here that occurred to me when reading these passages, and then I'll come back to the specific passage.
Please.
So in this section and in this book generally, Cicero, and I have a copy of the Latin as well in the Loeb Classical edition, so I've been looking at that as well. My Latin is far from perfect, but I can at least recognize key terms. And so there's this distinction that goes on through these sections of the book, where Cicero describes homo liber, the free man, and sometimes homo liberalis, the liberal or generous man. And that is contrasted with what he elsewhere calls homo sordidus. We can recognize our word sordid in there. So the sordid man, the vulgar, or the base man. And so when I saw that distinction, it made me think of someone else who's been featured in these podcasts, especially with respect to homo sordidus, the vulgar man, Philip Rieff. So Philip Rieff describes the modern psychological man, and I think Cicero's homo sordidus is a lot like that. So this is the man who lives according to his uncultivated passions, and so in one of Philip Rieff's versions of this is the kind of person who lets it all hang out. So that the sort of uncultivated person who follows his passions where they lead him. Whereas for Cicero, the free man, homo liber, is not free in the modern sense. He is very disciplined. He has to acquire all of these virtues and live according to all of these rules. In the older translation I have, homo liber is often translated as the gentleman, or being a gentleman, which I think is an appropriate translation, especially in 1915 when that translation came out. So the free man, the gentleman, is the one who has to cultivate these virtues, which he's going to discuss here, in himself, and also try to foster those virtues in others. So I think that's maybe the one way of looking at the project that Cicero is engaged in when he's discussing these different virtues, liberality being the first one that comes up here.
Well, that's excellent. I always appreciate a reference to Philip Rieff and a way to bring him in and popularize him. We've talked about him recently in some episodes of our other podcast, The Sower, and of course, you and I both contributed essays to the Philosophy of Philip Rieff, an edited volume that came out last year. I'll put a link to that book and some of those episodes in the description of this episode. I was thinking this is maybe from the sublime to the ridiculous, but one thing that pops into my head, listening to what you've had to say as well, is an example from a very different source, which was Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book. It is said, I think, in the Jungle Book of the Bandarlog, the monkey people, said of them rather contemptuously, they have no law. They merely do what they want. Right? Yeah. They're people without law. So the idea of having law, this is, of course, Kipling writing in his own place and time. Not too far removed from the 1915 of the Gentleman translation about fictional animal people, but the distinction between the law-governed, the liber, the one who is disciplined enough to be free, versus the one who is not, and so it's just sort of spread out and wasted across the sort of low or base kind of freedom.
Yes, right. That's exactly the point I was trying to make. And about this particular passage, maybe the one thing that might be surprising to people, well, I suppose it might be surprising that Cicero says that what we owe to another depends on his standing. I think in the original Latin, it's a dignitatis, like dignity. So it depends on the worthiness of the person. Are we as well? Okay, you could pose this question a few different ways. Are we as Christians to think of the worthiness of the recipient, or are we as modern humanitarians to think about the worthiness of the recipient? For Cicero, you do. And also, we have to make a judgment if we have a duty to help, we have a duty to understand or to make a judgment about whether our help is actually going to be good for that person. And if it's not, then we will not give him that assistance if we think it would harm him. So again, maybe that's the gentleman there using his superior judgment to judge what other people need. And that also, I don't know, it might be surprising or challenging to modern ethicists.
I would think certainly the more sort of egalitarian our instincts and our intuitions are, the more we might sort of stumble over the idea both of the judgment used in rendering generosity, and also the idea that some people are of greater dignity. So one would be generous towards a king or a prince or a superior in a different way from being generous towards a slave or a child or someone else. So, but we'll let Cicero, I think, speak to the specific question of stations. Why don't I take up sections 43 and 44 together, and I'll offer you first comment on those. There are, though, many, especially those greedy for renown and glory, who steal from one group the very money that they lavish upon another. They think that they will appear beneficent towards their friends if they enrich them by any method whatsoever. But that is so far from being a duty that in fact nothing could be more opposed to duty. We should therefore see that the liberality we exercise in assisting our friends does not harm anyone. Consequently, the transference of money by Lucius Sulla and Gaius Caesar from its lawful owners to others ought not to be seen as liberal. Nothing is liberal if it is not also just. The second need for caution is lest one's kindness exceeds one's capabilities. For those who want to be kinder than their possessions allow, first go wrong by being unjust to those nearest to them. They transfer to strangers resources which would more fairly be provided for or left to them. Usually there lurks within such liberality a greediness to plunder and deprive unjustly, so that resources may be available for lavish gifts. One can see that most men are not so much liberal by nature as drawn by a kind of glory. And in order to be seen to be beneficent, they do many things that appear to stem not from goodwill, but from ostentation. Such pretense is closer to sham than either to liberality or honorableness. So, a couple of important points in those two chapters, covering the first 2 points that were given us back in section 42. Ethan, what are your thoughts?
Well, we have a very elegant denunciation of Sulla and Caesar here, right? So the two dictators, and right, he says it very with a great deal of elegance and care, but essentially he's saying about them, it is not liberal, it is not generous to give property to people that you have stolen from others, right? And Sulla and Caesar, both as I think Sulla had been declared dictator at that point, they both had the ability to confiscate the property of some and give it to their cronies, to their friends, in order to gain the support of people, to make themselves look like they were generous, they were liberal, because they have this bounty to give, but they were able to do that by stealing from other citizens. So it is not generous to give stolen goods in order to make yourself look good. That's the simple way of putting what he says there.
Right, certainly a lesson with some political resonance in the present day.
Right, the tax of the to tax someone for the purpose of charity from that point of view would not be generous. It's not. It's a different sort of thing. Using compulsion to lavish goods on someone, but
Right.
by compelling others to give, in effect.
Well, he's saying, in fact, it's so far it's the polar opposite of generosity, we might say.
Right.
And he's still this idea that nothing is liberal if it is not also just. So justice is our sort of outer limit of everything liberal and generous. There's not going to be any kind of sort of purely relational generosity that we might want if we're thinking in Machiavelli's way. So if you violated justice, you can't claim to have this generosity or liberality about you.
That's right. Yeah.
Then chapter 44, right, is a warning against giving beyond your ability, right? Which he suggests, first off, if you give beyond your ability, you are stealing, as it were, from the people who had a clearer or higher title to the goods that you're giving. If I give away the mortgage money to the homeless man on the street, my wife and my children, to whom I had a duty to pay that mortgage for their benefit, would justly complain, that I had violated my duties of justice towards them. What more do you think we can get out of this chapter?
Well, I mean, this also might have some resonance for, say, the modern conception of humanitarianism, that perhaps we should give money to people who are on the other side of the planet and help them, perhaps at the expense of providing the best living or education for our own family, right? To deprive those to whom one has the most demanding duties for the sake of helping someone farther afield. That's not something that Cicero would support.
Right, right. And we're getting here to issues of telescopic philanthropy, which has been observed since the time of Dickens, and the question of what we owe to our fellow human beings. Is it just a sort of general obligation that follows to them because they are human, or is it somehow proportioned to their nearness to us, as though proximity were the only factor? Or, as Cicero is clearly assuming here, are we embedded in a network of social relations, each
Yeah.
of which carries a certain kind of needfulness and duty which we must pay? So I must pay this duty to my parents, and this duty to my children, and this duty to my close friends, and this duty to my acquaintances, such that there's almost a kind of content of that ethical duty that is given to me by the very character of the relationship, and, as you pointed out before, the dignitas of the other party that may be also relative to mine.
Right, and also, again, as he suggests here, one who tries to escape from those particular duties is doing so probably out of ostentation. Right? He wants to show off, and that would be the only that's the motive that one would expect to find for someone who is willing to take money from his family and give it to someone much farther afield.
Mhm. I think we're getting close to something like Ordo Amoris, which came up in the American political context somewhat recently, last year, was discussed by political figures and commentators. What's the nature of my duties to my fellow citizens, to resident aliens, to people abroad, etc. So I don't want to get into any of those political issues directly right here. Why don't we try to read chapter 45, and we'll wrap up this episode and return next week to continue talking about liberality. Ethan, would you care to read that one?
Yes. The third point I had laid down was that one should, when exercising beneficence, make choices according to standing. Here we should look both at the conduct of the man on whom we are conferring a kindness, and at the spirit in which he views us, at the association and fellowship of our lives together, and at the dutiful services that he has previously carried out for our benefit. It is desirable that all such considerations should come together. If they do not, then the more numerous and more important grounds will carry more weight.
All right, thank you. So book 1, chapter 45, an introduction to what's really going to occupy us through the whole rest of this treatment of liberality, a walkthrough of the different kinds of relationships that I would have, the different kinds of standings, or dignity, which people would have, which would dictate the level of generosity in terms of my material goods and also my time and attention that I would be willing to give in order to pay off what is needful in each case. And as he said before, the goal of justice and liberality is to pay what is due and not more than what's due and not more than one's capacity to give. And I would just note here, he starts broad and then he becomes more specific. And then he says, the proper judgment will take all of these factors into account and select the right level of generosity, of liberality towards that particular person at this place and time. So we go from the conduct of the person, his attitude towards us, the association of our lives, the services he's provided to us in the past. All of those things, we're getting into a kind of prudential judgment that's required for each particular act of generosity. So this is setting us up for the next 10 or 15 chapters or so of this book. Any
Right.
further comment, Ethan?
Well, and just maybe this is obvious, but the liberality, we have liberality to maintain relationships. That's the function that it's performing, is to maintain our relationships with other people, and we have to make judgments about those relationships in order to maintain them.
Very good. Absolutely. And that's important to remember here, that generosity here is considered under the virtue of justice. That is, it's precisely in order to serve the common good of the body politic, to maintain the relationships by giving what is appropriate and needful to maintain each relationship, that the whole republic, the whole city, and all the families and all the relationships involved are maintained and kept healthy, so that the polity functions well and we are related to each other as human beings ought to be.
Indeed.
Well, we're at about the half-hour mark now. I think this is a good time to wrap up this episode for this week of the On Duties podcast. I hope you'll join us again next Wednesday. I'm Chris Anadale. This is Ethan Alexander-Davey, and we will be coming back to talk with you next Wednesday, about Book 1, Chapter 46 and beyond, more about liberality. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye. Welcome back to the On Duties podcast, a production of the Ciceronian Society. I'm Christopher Anadale. I teach philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland. I also run a small YouTube channel with my name on it. Joining me today is Dr. Ethan Alexander-Davey. Ethan?
Yes, I teach political science at Camden University, specifically political theory and constitutional law, and I'm a big fan of Cicero and the Romans generally. So I look forward to these episodes.
Great. Well, we're glad you're joining us again here this Wednesday morning. This is the version of On Duties we're reading from, the Cambridge Text in the History of Political Thought translation by Griffin and Atkins. You're welcome to read along with us, or with any version which you happen to have in a slightly different translation. We have gotten as far as the middle of Cicero's treatment of liberality. We just finished with Book 1, Chapter 45, here now on page 20 of this version. We are, by my count, about a third of the way through the first book of On Duties. It consists of 3 books. So we'll pick up here, I think, with Chapter 46. Ethan, would you like to read that one?
Will do.
Thanks.
Since we do not live with men who are perfect and clearly wise, but with those who are doing splendidly if they have in them mere images of virtue, I think that we must understand this too. No one should be wholly neglected if any indication of virtue appears in him. Moreover, one must particularly foster those who are most graced with the gentler virtues, modesty, restraint, and that very justice which I have now been discussing at length. For a brave and great spirit in a man who is not perfect nor wise is generally too impetuous, but those other virtues seem rather to attach themselves to a good man. That is all on the question of conduct.
So this is the first treatment that Cicero is here at this point talking to us about the different standings according to which we ought to be liberal towards, and be generous towards people with whom we are related. And the first is conduct. Well, is he a good man or a bad man? We don't live with perfect people. We shouldn't expect to be generous only to those who are pure and good. But what does he say? We ought not to neglect any indication of virtue, especially those more modest virtues, modesty, restraint, and justice. Seems to be saying, he doesn't say much about it. He says, now I'm finished with talking about conduct and virtue. One ought to be generous towards those who are at least trying to be good. Is that right?
One ought to be generous toward those who are trying to be good. And I think this might be the passage that I had in mind in our previous episode when I said that one of the duties of the gentleman is to foster gentlemanliness in others, right? So he is the one who he has cultivated these virtues in himself, and he can them in others. And where he sees them, he ought to try to foster them. So, and especially as he says, those with the gentler virtues, modesty, restraint, and the justice that I have been discussing, he is to try to find those people and to help them to further develop so that they too can exercise the virtues.
Right. I have thinking here, you and I both share a common profession and station. We're university teachers. And I might think, since this is a work of practical advice, part of the practical advice is among the people you encounter, people in your charge, people over whom you have influence, find the people who are sort of working on these particular virtues and lift them up, give to them. Why? Precisely because those particular virtues of modesty and restraint in a person who already has a sort of inward greatness of spirit and ambition, those are the virtues that are going to make him into a gentleman. So among the 100 or more students I might see each semester, I ought to be sensitive too that the 2 or 3 who could really profit from, get the sort of most return on a certain kind of attention and investment and generosity from my part as a superior or as a teacher, as a mentor.
Right. I think that's well said. I mean, this is part of what a big part of what a liberal education is about, is trying to again to foster those qualities in those who at least display some hint of them to begin with.
Just so. All right. Well, let me take us into the next chapters. Chapters 47 and 48 I'll cover together. On the subject of the goodwill that each person has towards us, the first consideration of duty is that we should grant the most to the one who is most fond of us. But we should judge goodwill not as adolescents do, by the strength of its burning passion, but rather by its firmness and constancy. If services have already been rendered, that is, if you have not to inspire gratitude, but rather to requite it, then you must take even greater care, for no duty is more necessary than that of requiting gratitude. For if, as Hesiod commands, you should return in greater measure, provided that you can, anything that you have needed to borrow, what should we do when challenged by an unsought favor? Should we not take as our model the fertile fields which bring forth much more than they have received? We do not hesitate to perform dutiful services for those whom we hope will assist us in the future. What then ought we to be like towards those who have already assisted us? There are 2 aspects of liberality. First, granting a kind service, and secondly, returning it. Whether we grant one or not is up to us. A good man, however, is not permitted to fail to return one, provided, of course, that he can do so without injustice. Ethan, your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is one of those moments where, and I forgot to mention this before, but in the introduction to my old translation with the Latin by Walter Miller, he says in there that I think he describes Cicero as the most Christian of the pagans, right? So he's in many ways it feels like we're reading and listening to a Christian, but of course there are some differences, right? So this emphasis on giving back to those who have given to us, I think we know that Christianity demands more of us than that, right? To give to people who have not given to us, and Cicero doesn't exclude that possibility, but it seems his focus is that we owe the most to those who have already given to us, to those with whom we already have a relationship, to those who are already fond of us, and we owe them a return of that generosity and that good feeling. So there's more of an emphasis on that than we would find in Christianity, which asks you to give even to those who have given you nothing and possibly couldn't give you anything.
That's an interesting point, right? Of course, there is almost a kind of there's a rising above, or even an expectation that that's the baseline, right? Even the pagans, will help those who have helped them. Yeah. That's no credit to you, right? Says the Lord. But to give to one who hasn't given to you. I'm thinking here in Cicero's defense, or sort of to think through his worldview, to fail to requite generosity might be, I say, to fall the farthest short of ideal human behavior. That is, if you want to achieve great things, you also want to avoid great errors. And the greatest error for a gentleman would be to receive generosity and not to even attempt to recognize and requite it. So that's a duty in the sense that your natural perfection, which of course Christian perfection would seek to go beyond, would require you above all, in addition to being generous yourself, to take into account people's prior generosity to you. So it's not a thing to be despised as unworthy, but perhaps to be an object of ambition, to be achieved, and then to rise to the next level with the help of God's grace.
I like the way you put it better than the way I put it. I think that's good.
Okay. All right. We have so it would be possible to misunderstand this initial statement, right? We should think most of those who are most fond of us, but when we think of it in terms of sustaining relationships through the mutual paying and giving of obligation, that both the attraction of that ideal and the sort of superior attractiveness of the Christian ideal maybe both make sense. Mm-hmm. So, Ethan, why don't I ask you to read chapters 49 and 50, I think, also go together, though it's most of page 21. Do you think you could take us through that?
Yes.
Thanks so much.
We must, moreover, discriminate between kind services we have received, and there is no doubt but that the greater the kindness, the more is owed to its bestower. Here we must first of all weigh up the spirit in which each man has acted, his devotion and his goodwill. For many men do many things out of a certain rashness, failing to use their judgment, or maybe inspired by a frenzied or sudden impulse of the spirit towards everyone, like a gust of wind. Such favors should not be considered as important as those that are conferred through judgment, with forethought and constancy. In granting favors, on the other hand, and in requiting gratitude, the most important function of duty, if all else is equal, is to enrich above all the person who is most in need of riches. But people generally do exactly the opposite, for they defer above all to him from whom they expect the most, even though he does not need them. Also, the fellowship between men and their common bonding will best be preserved if the closer someone is to you, the more kindness you confer upon him. Perhaps, though, we should examine more thoroughly what are the natural principles of human fellowship and community. First is something that is seen in the fellowship of the entire human race, for its bonding consists of reason and speech which reconcile men to one another through teaching, learning, communicating, debating, and making judgments, and unite them in a kind of natural fellowship. It is this that most distances us from the nature of other animals. To them we often impute courage, as with horses or lions, but we do not impute to them justice, fairness, or goodness, for they have no share in reason and speech.
Very good. Thank you so much. So what have we here, if I could take the lead on this? Chapter 49, a long one. We've gone from saying that we should requite generosity, we should favor those who have shown most favor to us, and that's just a matter of gentlemanliness and of appropriate human spirit. We should discriminate between services done to us. The greater the kindness, the more we owe. Weigh the spirit in which a man has acted, but also enrich above all the person who's most in need. So to give generously to a benefactor who has no need of what we can give him. And here we sort of also kind of feel like we're hitting the ceiling of natural generosity, looking forward to supernatural generosity. What can we requite to God for what he's given us? We ought to take into account, not act as most people act, which is to defer above all to him from whom they expect most, right? To give generously to the man who's already wealthy. Well, this amounts to a certain kind of criticism of maybe a kind of what we might call a patronage system in Cicero's time, doesn't it?
Right, it does. Right, and the patronage system was quite a thing in the Roman Republic. But right, so the it is not just, it is not generous to give to those from whom we expect some kind of benefit when but of course this is, we're still within this context of requiting, right? So we are if we have a friend who has helped us before, who has been good to us, and he is in need, we should come to his rescue before we requite others. So it's still within this context of maintaining existing relationships and returning kindness with kindness.
Right. Right, exactly. And then the following section, um, the closer someone is to you, the more kindness you should confer upon him. And here we're getting close to something like the preference that I show for my family, which is not simply a sort of irrational prejudice for people in my bloodline or people whom I see every day, but really amounts to a recognition of a real difference in my duties towards people who are differently related to me. What do you make of this final paragraph about the principles of human fellowship and community, the bond of the human race, and this comparison to animals?
Right. So here is where we get Cicero is beginning to set up his hierarchy of duties to different sorts of people, right? So and we begin here with the minimum, right? So we are all, as human beings, we are all part of one general community, one universal community, and we owe to human beings as human beings at least something. And when we get to much later in the book, when it comes to things like international relations and war, it turns out we owe them quite a lot, or they're quite significant things. But just as members of the same species, we owe our fellow human beings something, and that's because we share something. We share the faculty of reason and speech, the ability to understand what justice is, and so that means that we owe at least something to our fellow man, even if we have no closer relations with them. And later on, he gets a little bit more specific about what we might owe them.
Yeah, I would just close by noting that we can impute a certain kind of courage to animals, but we would never impute justice to them because justice depends upon this logos and speech and the kind of sophisticated community that we have among ourselves as human beings. So we might say an animal can show courage or cowardice by kind of analogy, but never justice or injustice. We don't regard the animals, even among their own species, as behaving with justice towards each other.
So we assume here that all members of the human race can understand justice to some degree that is deserving of our respect.
Okay. I think I did the last reading. Ethan, would you mind reading chapters 51 and 52? Or I'm sorry, no. Did you read last? Did you not?
I think I did, yes.
I'm so sorry. Why don't I take the 51 and 52?
That's right,
Apologies.
but you almost fooled me there.
Yeah, I'd forgotten myself. On page 22 then. The most widespread fellowship existing among men is that of all with all others. Here we must preserve the communal sharing of all things that nature brings forth for the common use of mankind, in such a way that whatever is assigned by statutes and civil law should remain in such possession as those laws may have laid down. but the rest should be regarded as the Greek proverb has it, everything is common among friends. The things that are common to all men seem to be the kind that Ennius defines in one case, from which we can extrapolate to many cases. A man who kindly shows the path to someone who is lost lights another's light, so to speak, from his own, for his own shines no less because he has lit another's. With this one instance, he advises us that if any assistance can be provided without detriment to oneself, it should be given even to a stranger. Therefore, such things as the following are to be shared. One should not keep others from fresh water, should allow them to take fire from your fire, should give trustworthy counsel to someone who is seeking advice, for they are useful to those who receive them and cause no trouble to the giver. We should therefore both make use of them and always be contributing something to the common benefit. Since, though the resources of individuals are small, but the mass of those who are in need is infinitely great, general liberality must be measured according to the limit laid down by Ennius, that his own light shine no less. Then we shall still be capable of being liberal to those close to us.
Right. So the key line here seems to me, with respect to people who are just members of the human race and we have no other connection to them, we should give them any assistance that we can without detriment to ourselves, and without detriment to those who are most close to us, right? So, and then, of course, a lot of this seems to be in the context of, travelers encountering each other on the road, right? So don't deny to a stranger fresh water or fire or any of these things, which it doesn't cost you anything to give him. It doesn't harm you to give him, and we at least owe other members of the human race that.
Right. Well, it seems in economic terms, where there is no scarcity, it would be mean and base to try to prevent somebody from drawing from it if they can benefit at no cost to you. Well, there's the sort of primary, sort of absolute baseline of generosity expected towards anybody, even a stranger. I thought it's interesting that he goes from the obvious examples of if there's a source of fresh water, you don't stand in the way of people getting access to it. Since a fire can be lit from a larger fire without diminishing the first fire, obviously people can light their fire from your fire if you already have one going. And then his third one is social, right? Give good advice. Give sound advice. Doesn't hurt you to give good advice to someone. You shouldn't be suspicious of what they'll do with the good advice that you give. Advice like fresh water, like fire, is one of those things which should be given freely because it is of absolutely no cost.
Right, and then in this context of travel, it might be, how do I get to that city over there? Right, so don't tell them the wrong way. Be kind and give them good directions, or what they might, what steps or preparations they might want to undertake when they get to this place. So be right. Give what you can. Give what you can, and that does no harm to you.
Well, it seems also fundamentally irrational and even anti-human to try to be, sparing with things of which there is an infinite abundance,
right?
Like things like fire and water and the like.
Of course, in modern times, countries go to war over supplies of fresh water, so this gets sticky. But right, as you say, assuming that we're not dealing with conditions of scarcity, one should give these things freely.
Right. Right. So I think we're back on sequence now. Could I ask you to read 53 and 54?
Yes. There are indeed several degrees of fellowship among men. To move from the one that is unlimited, next there is a closer one of the same race, tribe, and tongue, through which men are bound strongly to one another. More intimate still is that of the same city, as citizens have many things that are shared with one another: the forum, temples, porticos, and roads, laws and legal rights, law courts and political elections, And besides these acquaintances and companionship, and those business and commercial transactions that many of them make with many others, a tie narrower still is that of the fellowship between relations. Moving from that vast fellowship of the human race, we end up with a confined and a limited one. For since it is by nature common to all animals that they have a drive to procreate, the first fellowship exists within marriage itself, and the next with one's children. Then there is the one house in which everything is shared. Indeed, that is the principle of a city and the seedbed, as it were, of a political community. Next, there follow bonds between brothers, and then between first cousins and second cousins, who cannot be contained in one house and go out to other houses as if to colonies. Finally, there follow marriages, and those connections of marriage from which even more relations arise. In such propagation and increase, political communities have their origin. Moreover, the bonding of blood holds men together by goodwill and by love.
Okay, end of chapter 54. Obviously, here we can feel the focus narrowing. We've gone from the absolute minimal obligations we owe of generosity in justice towards strangers, towards anybody, especially with goods that are abundant and not scarce, and which can be given with no loss to ourselves. Now, in a sense, it's beginning to bite a little bit into who and what we are, to the limited resources that I have. Well, to whom do I give? Well, we consider first bonds of race, tribe, and tongue, of nationality, of co-ethnicity, of tribe, then the more intimate bonds of city, and then within the family to marriage, to spouse, to children, to the household, and then sort of expanding outward to the larger network of families. We haven't been told precisely here what is owed at each level, but we've been given the principle previously, haven't we, that the closer tie should outweigh or be preferred to the more remote one.
That's right. And so I've been trying to think about how to characterize the obligations of race, tribe, and tongue on the one hand, and the obligations to those with whom one shares daily interactions and political rights and political participation and all of that. And so maybe, and by the way, the word behind tribe there is nationis, nation. This is the origin of our word nation. So it seems to me maybe one way of thinking about that is that we owe more to the people with whom we share a city or town than we do to the larger nation, but that could be tricky given what Cicero says about that our first duty later on is to our fatherland, and how are we defining that? Or are we talking about you have co-ethnics here, you have co-ethnics in some other place, and you owe more to the ones with whom you have daily interactions and duties than to the ones who are farther afield. So that's a little complicated to think about how that would apply to our present situation. But this is the kind of question that he wants us to grapple with.
Right. And it seems to me as we put more layers on the board, let's think of overlapping transparencies, perhaps, as we have more and more layers to consider and more relationships and cousins, and then I also have the behavior of my cousins, whether they've been generous or favorably or ill-disposed towards me in the past. The more factors we take into account, I think the more we retreat from the area of general rules, where I can say, don't stop people from having access to fresh water if you're standing in their way, or they ask to light from your fire, ask you for advice on the road. I can't really give a rule about this, because the job of a wise person is to take account of the reality of all the different elements of the relationship and judge under this present circumstance what's the prudential level of generosity to be given to this person in this time, given the limitation on resources, the demands of other people, the expectations for the future, the uncertainties of the present circumstances. And it would, I assume, be easier to get this wrong, because there is no, it's not a matter of just being baseline correct about giving people access to abundant resources, but of assigning what little or much that you have to each appropriately according to the overall network and the demands, all the totality of demands upon you.
Right, and also as when we get into a paragraph or chapter 54, right, it also seems complicated to what do we owe to which parts of our family and our kin? Those are a series of questions in there that are can be difficult.
Right. And we also, of course, he calls this the seedbed of the city and of even of political life. So this is really not
Right, the household, the family is the seedbed.
right, right. The family is the seedbed. So we have to get this right. We would say that this is where we will sort of face our initial and most important test of generosity and correctness. I would hope that, Cicero himself is practicing justice and appropriate liberality among the members of his household and his immediate family, including his son, to whom he's writing this book of advice. And that's the foundation, that in a sense is the gateway through which he's then approaching his generosity to his fellow citizens, to his fellow defenders of the Republic, to other people to whom with whom maybe he shares a common citizenship, but not a common ideology or loyalty. People who are trying to subvert the Republic, for example. Uh, any final thoughts on that? I think we're about at the half-hour mark right now. Thoughts of where we've come so far? We've come through the end of chapter 54.
Well, right. We have more questions to sort out about what we owe to whom, and we'll see more about that in the next few sections.
All right. Well, we'll return to book 1, chapter 55 next week, next Wednesday. I want to thank you for joining Ethan and myself today for this episode of the On Duties podcast. We look forward to you being with us in the future. In the meantime, feel free to like and share this video, to leave a comment below if you have any questions or ideas or reactions to what we've said. You should also check out our society's website at ciceroniansociety.org. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye. Hello, and welcome back to the On Duties podcast, a production of the Ciceronian Society. We will be publishing episodes every Wednesday throughout 2026, reading through all of On Duties with commentary from a variety of hosts and guests. I am Chris Anadale, a podcast editor for the Society. I teach philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University, and I also run a small YouTube channel of my own. Joining me today is Ethan Alexander-Davey, an associate professor of political science at Campbell University, and the co-editor of Aristocratic Souls in Democratic Times and Aristocratic Voices, Forgotten Arguments About Virtue, Authority, and Inequality, both published by Lexington Books. Ethan's also an occasional host on our other podcast, The Sower, especially with episodes about obscure 19th century Russian thinkers. Joining us today for the first time is a new host. This is Dr. Ben Peterson, an assistant professor of political science at Abilene Christian University. His research and teaching focus on political theory. He writes about constitutional theory and the institutional implications of differing philosophical and religious foundations. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. I've been excited to follow along and read along with you and Josh and everybody who's been involved. So thanks for the invitation.
No, you're most welcome. Let me also here give a shout out and a big thanks to our prior hosts. That's Josh Bowman, Executive Director of the Ciceronian Society, and Katherine Bradshaw of the Ancient Languages Institute. We hope to have both of them back on here as part of a rotating cast of hosts over the course of the entire year podcast. So thanks to them, and thanks also, of course, to Ethan and Ben for joining us today. Ben, since you're new on the podcast, why don't you tell us a bit about your experience with Cicero and your approach to his work?
Thanks, certainly. So Yeah, I teach, a kind of grab bag of courses on American politics, political theory, research methods, these kinds of things. I do teach a course on ancient political theory, and that's where we read, in that course, we read The Republic and the Laws by Cicero, along with works of other thinkers. So I'm by no means an expert on Cicero or Cicero's writings, but I've kind of backed into interest in Cicero from writing I've done on the American founders, specifically John Adams. And so he paid attention certainly to Cicero's work very, very closely, and even some scholars think modeled himself off of, to some degree, of Cicero on Cicero in his life. The other thing I'll say is this summer I had occasion to read a book by Josiah Osgood called Lawless Republic, The Rise of Cicero and the Decline of Rome. And he's a classicist, and it's a really fascinating book of, sort of Cicero in action in the legal sphere and the political sphere. And so I've kind of have that in the back of my mind as I'm reading through On Duties as well.
Excellent. That's great. Fantastic. We are partway through, still book one of the three books of On Duties. Ethan, last episode, you and I ended with chapter 54 of book one, which ends actually in the middle of a sentence. So why don't I ask you to begin us reading, perhaps going back to the beginning of the sentence and taking us through chapter 55. And why don't we say 56 as well, because they're both short.
All right, sure. Yeah, and I was going to do that anyway. Let's not start mid-sentence.
This is on page 23
Page
of
23, that's right.
translation we're using.
In such propagation and increase, political communities have their origin. Moreover, the bonding of blood holds men together by goodwill and by love. For it is a great thing to have the same ancestral memorials, to practice the same religious rites, and to share common ancestral tombs. Of all fellowships, however, none is more important and none stronger than when good men of similar conduct are bound by familiarity. For honorableness, the thing that I so often mention, moves us even if we see it in someone else, and makes us friends of him in whom it seems to reside. All virtue indeed lures us to itself and leads us to love those in whom it seems to reside, but justice and liberality do so the most. Moreover, nothing is more lovable and nothing more tightly binding than similarity in conduct that is good. For when men have similar pursuits and inclinations, it comes about that each one is as much delighted with the other as he is with himself. The result is what Pythagoras wanted in friendship, that several be united into one. Important also are the common bonds that are created by kindnesses reciprocally given and received, which, provided that they are mutual and gratefully received, bind together those concerned in an unshakable fellowship.
Thank you, Ethan. That's very good. I forgot to mention, we have left behind justice. We're moving now we are now in the middle of Cicero's treatment of liberality, which is generous actions that are motivated by our justice. Ben, what do you make of what we've just read?
I'll make kind of two points that stick out to me. One, it seems that counter to, as I think I heard both of you talking about on a previous episode, counter to a kind of Hobbesian view of human nature, it seems to me Cicero highlights the attractiveness of the virtues we're talking about, of liberality and justice in particular, that there's something that sort of pulls people who, especially people who are trying to inculcate those virtues and live by those virtues. They see that in other people of similar good conduct, and there's a natural attraction and kind of bonding and force multiplication that kind of happens. So we're kind of naturally attracted to these virtues, and we appreciate seeing them in others and want to be close to them and these kinds of things. So that's one thing. A second is more of a complicating point. I mean, in the previous few chapters, Cicero has started with our most general bonds, right, with all of humankind, all of human beings, working down to our most narrow bonds in the city and the family. But here there's kind of this interesting kind of bond that's introduced as well between people of good contact, people who similarly have good contact, who have familiarity because of that kind of shared sense of virtue. And that could be a kind of cross-cutting, there's nothing that has to be based only on proximity in that kind of connection, right? And so it's just an interesting kind of complicating factor there as well. So those are two things that I'll throw out.
Yeah, I agree. I would add also, I see the same thing here. He begins, this is chapters 53 and 54. He begins from describing the most general human fellowship and then narrows it down to tribe, to city, to relation, and then expands back out again a bit. Of course, we begin in the family and marriage. The family is the foundation of virtue, out to the city. And then he tells us in the passage that Ethan's just read that um, of fellowships, none is more important than honor, in a sense, friendship, right? Honorable friendship between good men. And this is the thing that will tie us all together. It seems to, in a sense, ride atop the kind of natural familial affection. And even in a sense, it seems to fill out and occupy some of the space of political fellowship, because he's going to talk later about our duty to the Republic and the way in which we're tied together by it. But it seems to me when he's talking about the strengthening of this bond of honor between good people, men of good conduct, by this kind of mutual kindness that they show to each other, it seems to me he's talking primarily about friendship as this kind of noble ideal. Of course, he has another dialogue on friendship as well. Ethan, did you have anything to add?
I was just going to point out, here's the dialogue on friendship. So this is these reflections here are a small portion of what he says elsewhere about this. But I think one should note that, of course, there's Aristotle's notion of virtue friendship is one of the sources behind what he's saying here. That this is something that Aristotle speaks of at length in the Ethics. I think there are two whole books devoted to it. That the best kind of friendship is the one in which people come together on the basis of shared virtues, and they recognize in each other those shared virtues, and they are also inspired by each other to pursue what virtue demands, but by seeing this in other people as well. And this is also, if you think about the way Cicero describes statesmanship, we're going to see in a later passage the opposition between a virtuous group of statesmen who are in some sense equal to each other, and then the one man who wants to be the most preeminent of all. And of course, it's the former model that Cicero prefers, and that Cicero thinks is best for a republic. And I was going to note, right? So we have these different bonds that people have. So before this discussion of friendship on the basis of virtue, we also have the more primordial bonds, right, of the family, which he says are the basis of political communities, right? So the marriages that join together different families, and then we have these communities based on common ancestral memorials, common religious rites, common ancestral tombs. That is the basis, the first origin of a political community, and then it can develop other ties as well, but that's the most primordial root of it.
Right, right. Excellent. Well, we're well on our way. Ben, would you like to read chapter 57 for us?
Certainly. But when you have surveyed everything with reason and spirit, of all fellowships, none is more serious and none dearer than that of each of us with the Republic. Parents are dear, and children, relatives and acquaintances are dear, but our country has on its own embraced all the affections of all of us. What good man would hesitate to face death on her behalf if it would do her a service? How much more detestable, then, is the monstrousness of those who have savaged their country with all manner of crime, and who have been, and are still, engaged in destroying her utterly.
All right. Well, this is a short section, but worthy of some comment. And we're talking about the kind of obligation, the officium that we owe to the Republic, to the common good, the res publica. Parents are dear and children, but above all of these is the polity to which we owe everything. My first thought on listening to this is that Cicero doesn't really present us with an argument for this. This is just sort of a very forceful orator's observation, right? How glorious is the love of the Republic, how primordial, how fundamental, how demanding it is. And of course, how disgusting and what could be worse than a man like, Mark Antony, who is attempting to subvert and undermine and destroy the Republic. Now, I'm keeping in mind, of course, this is at least in part a book written by a father to his son to sort of strengthen him in his knowledge of and ability to calculate and follow out his duty. But is this a shift of tone, right? We've talked about natural bonds, we've talked about bonds of virtue and friendship and mutual kindness between good men, and then sort of here, supreme above all of these things is the love and duty and obedience and defense that we owe to the Republic, even more so than to our parents and to our children. But either one of you care to comment on that or add to that?
Well, he's going to give an argument for it in the next paragraph, but yes, it might not be what we moderns would expect to hear, right? We might be more likely as moderns to say that our family is first, or that country is not first, or that our religion is first. But for Cicero, this also reflects, for instance, what is said in Plato's Apology of Socrates, where the fatherland is first, that your first duty is to your fatherland, because without it, you wouldn't be able to enjoy any of these other things. You wouldn't be able to enjoy these other loves that you have. So this is consistent with also the ancient Greek view that fatherland is first, although the Greeks didn't have, as far as I could tell, the additional duties to the rest of humanity that Cicero expresses.
Mm-hmm. Ben?
Yes, we'll see a bit more of an argument in a second, but I think you're right to see a kind of shift in tone here. It's interesting, he says, at least in this translation, this is the most serious fellowship, right? And there's something weighty about this, our connection with our country. It's also, unless I'm mistaken, all the other sort of possible fellowships he mentioned or bonds that we have with people sort of naturally draw us. But this one, there are people who are interested in trashing it, right? There are people who are committing crimes against it. And so it's sort of a delicate kind of fellowship that needs, and I think it's also the first thing he's mentioned, willingness to die for, right? And so it requires sacrifice in a special way. It requires defense in a way that maybe some of the other bonds are more natural and they sort of naturally draw our loyalties, whereas this one requires a certain kind of motivation and intentionality, to use a common word today, that kind of thing.
Okay, absolutely. Well, let me push us forward. I'll read chapter 58 and we'll move on. Ben, I'll give you first comment so we know who's going in what order. Now, were there a comparison or competition as to who ought most to receive our dutiful services, our country and our parents would be foremost, for we are obliged to them for the greatest kindnesses. Next would be our children and our whole household, which looks to us alone and can have no other refuge. Then our relations, who are congenial to us and with whom even our fortunes are generally shared. Therefore, whatever is necessary to support life is most owed to those whom I have just mentioned. On the other hand, a shared life and a shared living, counsel and conversation, encouragement, comfort, and sometimes even reproofs, flourish most of all in friendships, and friendship is most pleasing when it is cemented by similarity of conduct.
So I think here, we start to see some of the argument, and we've sort of gotten all these different kinds of bonds on the table, and now we have to start figuring out, okay, how do we, if there were a competition, right? It's kind of, if we had to choose, how do you rank these? And I do think there's a kind of logic here, and it connects with something he's talking about in chapter 47, where he says that duties owed on the basis of gratitude are kind of like, if there's one principle, you must fulfill those, right? Those are the most important to fulfill. And so I do think that's part of his argument here is that the duties we owe to our country are on the basis of gratitude and our parents, right? Um, Also connected in those chapters where he's discussing that principle that we ought to pay back people who have done good turns for us. We should make it a priority to do good turns for them. And that's so our temptation, if you want to call it, our tendency is going to be to do good to those that we expect to receive good from in the future, or we might if we do good to them. And so here the order is country first. It's already given us our life, our all lots of things, our parents, then our children, who we really don't expect, that's on the we don't really expect to receive a lot from them. They depend on us. Right. And so I think that's something like part of the order here. And then we get further differentiation about, what friends are owed and things like that. But I think that might get, there's a logic he's incorporating here.
I would agree. Go ahead. Go ahead.
If I could add to that, it does strike me that it seems like the two lowest levels of this hierarchy of duties are both connected to gratitude. First, those to whom we owe gratitude, our parents and our country, both in their way, bring us into being and sustain us, and those who owe us gratitude. And it strikes me, again, whenever I read this, it is in part because they can have no other refuge. If you don't take care of them, they don't get taken care of. They are widows and orphans. They are without a defender. That imposes a special burden upon you as the one who receives and should receive their gratitude to actually perform your duty with respect to them. Then we can begin talking about the other kinds of duties, the duties that go beyond just providing, that require less than perhaps giving what is necessary for life, but can give other kinds of goods. Ethan?
Right. Well, I think I agree that gratitude seems to be the basis for the ranking here, right? So we owe most. Our country has given us the most. Without it, we might not even be able to enjoy family life. And then next, we owe our parents so much. Without them, we wouldn't exist. And so that I think the basis for the ranking is how much we owed to those, how much our country and our parents have given us.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Ben, any final thoughts before we move on?
I do have a quick thought, and this is a bit anachronistic, I suppose, but I believe that thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and other Christian thinkers would also kind of connect the command in the Ten Commandments to honor your father and mother with your duty to your country, right? And there's on the basis of gratitude and thankfulness for life and the gifts that we've received from them and that kind of thing. The other kind of anachronistic question I'll throw out as Christians is, where does the church fit on this list? Or it could be involved in, in an intersecting way or in all of them. And so just an interesting, thing to kind of think from that perspective.
Right. That is an interesting question. And it's Cicero doesn't really have that as a distinct category, does he? But I mean, church and state were sort of part of the same thing for him. And in the other work that we've both taught, Ben, you might remember the Dream of Scipio, where Cicero imagines the afterlife where people are rewarded for their duty for performing their duty to the fatherland. So that's the ancient Roman conception of heaven, is where you are rewarded for serving your fatherland.
Ethan, why don't we move on and have you read chapter 59?
But one ought, when bestowing all these dutiful services, to look at what each person most greatly needs, and what each would or would not be able to secure without our help. Thus the degrees of ties of relationship will not be the same as those of circumstance. Some duties are owed to one group of people rather than to another. You should, for example, assist your neighbor sooner than your brother or companion in gathering his harvest. But you should, in a suit in the law courts, defend a relative or friend rather than your neighbor. In every case of duty, therefore, considerations such as these ought to be examined, and we should adopt this habit and should practice so that we can become good calculators of our duties and can see by adding and subtracting what is the sum that remains. From this, you can understand how much is owed to each person.
Thank you, Ethan. I like very much the expression to become good calculators of duties. That's really the kind of intellectual and moral skill that we need to get out of a work like this and similar works. Ben, your thoughts?
Just on what you just said there, that passage kind of, brought to mind the so-called philosophic calculus from the utilitarian way of thinking, right? Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham who promoted this idea. And here we have, something like a kind of honorific calculus, right? Is that they're all different, or maybe the honorific arithmetic, right? He's just adding and subtracting, right? And it does strike me as a little interesting that Cicero a couple times kind of says, once you kind of think through all these things, it's actually pretty easy to figure out, what you owe to whom at what times. You just got to think about all these things. But he will at the same time in that last part of that passage, talk about how it really takes experience. You have to figure out when does the closeness of the bond, demand an immediate response, or when is the need less such that even someone with a more distant bond with a greater need might demand your attention more. And so there's this kind of dynamic weighing of responsibilities. I think one thing I take away from what Cicero's trying to do is to say, and you all mentioned this in a previous episode about even duties to slaves in this culture, right? Everybody is a potential claimant on our time and attention, right? In some situation and in some way. But then it becomes a matter of weighing all these different factors about how we relate to them, their needs and our needs, our gratitude, as we talked about, all these different things. And so it's a very rich conception, if not clearly formulaic.
Right. Prudence came to mind when I was thinking about this as well, and as well as the following chapter. Ethan?
Right, and it seems to me that right, unless one has experience, this would not be easy. The gentleman is going to have to cultivate this prudence, and probably over a fairly long period of time before he understands when to give to whom and under what circumstances. So this is right. Not one would have to have sufficient leisure and education even to understand how to do this, I think.
Right. Ben, why don't you finish us off this episode by reading chapter 60, and we'll discuss that, and that'll bring us to the end of this discussion of liberality.
Okay. But neither doctors, nor generals, nor orators are able, however much they have taken to heart advice about their art, to achieve anything very worthy of praise without experience and practice. Similarly, advice on observing duty certainly has been handed down, as I myself am now handing it down, but a matter of such importance also demands experience and practice. And now I have said enough on the question of how honorableness, upon which duty hangs, is derived from those things that constitute the justice of human fellowship.
Very good. Thanks. Thank you, Ben. That takes us to the top of page 25. We were just speaking about this prudence and experience. And it occurs to me there's a kind of a parallel oratorical structure here with chapter 41, which ended his discussion of justice by observing sort of concluding thought, sort of an orator's final image that you can take away, that he said there justice can be done by force or by deceit, by the lion or by the fox. And here we have after gone through all the different hierarchy of obligations that one would feel, the kind of services that we would owe and why and to whom, he ends up saying, well, of course you need experience and good judgment and practice in order to implement these things. These are not, when they're handed down as general rules and guidelines to be understood through implementing them in your life and in practice. And that seems to be kind of the exclamation point at the end of this multi-page consideration of liberality. Ethan, what do you think?
Right, and well, I like to say things that are expected of me as the person who writes about aristocracy. But right, so in this line, Cicero is saying, "And I am handing down my experience to you, my son." Right, and so the tradition in the Roman Senate was that the the son was expected to take his father's place, right? So there's this notion of hereditary knowledge here, or knowledge that is transmitted from the father to the son, and that's before the young gentleman has experience, he would rely on his father's experience about how to make these decisions.
Ben?
I just to underscore what we've said about prudence and experience. I mean, it is interesting to think about to compare learning, honorableness, virtue, duty with an art, right? An art form that requires cultivation and practice, and yes, book learning, but also, and maybe even more importantly, confrontation with actual situations that require you to make decisions and require you to make judgments about where your duties most lie, or how your actions can meet your duties, right? And I just find the language is again rich with this idea that these are the specific duties that are about justice and liberality, that are about kind of continuing, fostering, supporting the bonds of human fellowship, right? It's, I think, a really rich way to think about duties.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. I would just add myself that I know he introduces chapter 60 by saying, neither doctors nor generals nor orators are able to work without experience. And you might think here there's a kind of collection. Generals who pursue victory in war, the doctor who pursues health, the health of the body, and then I think in the class in which he places himself, not the philosopher, the sort of abstract thinker, but the orator who sort of exhorts to virtue, who is passing down what he's doing. Even he requires experience, and he's therefore recommending experience for whatever walk of life, whatever arena of excellence his son will be trying to prove himself in. So that takes us to this conclusion of this thought about liberality and how liberality flows from justice. The next chapters are about greatness of spirit, both the benefits, the glory of having a great spirit, its necessity, and also the temptations and the hazards that can come to the great spirited person or the ambitious person. So that brings us to the close of this episode 11 of the On Duties podcast. I want to thank my co-hosts, Ethan Alexander-Davey and Ben Peterson. Thank you, gentlemen. If you've enjoyed this, we hope that you will subscribe to this channel or this podcast, share this episode with a friend, tell some people about it, and look for more content. We'll be back with you next Wednesday for another episode looking at reading further into On Duties. Thank you for listening.